Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. At this time, I'll open the Yamhill County Board of Commissioners formal informal session for March 18th, 2021, and we'll start with a flag salute. Todd, would you lead us in the pledge, please? To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Caught me with my speaker off, Mary.
Okay. All righty. So at this time, we'll look at additions to and updates to the calendar, the joint calendar. Does anybody have anything that needs to be added to our joint calendar?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so we have nothing to add to our joint meetings calendar. We'll move on to public comment. We have received public comments via email. Thank you, Carolina, for getting those to us. And we received new comments this morning, some related to, most of them related to agenda items, actually, for today's agenda. On to item E, our work session. This time is reserved for topics of discussion, and our work session this morning will center around the next steps for the Amhelis West Sider Trail Bridge for the master planning and the other Trail Bridge project and master planning grants. So Ken, do you want to bring us up to speed on where we need, what our jumping off point should be?
Yes, thank you, Chair. What I had right now with the current status of the conditional use permit application, and there was a lot of question marks. Like I believe I've spoken to you individually and at a previous board session. There's a number of items that are still pending that staff is looking for some additional direction on how the board would like to proceed. And the main elements that I have, just like on the agenda, the first main topic, and in the interest of being able to kind of get through the list of items that we have to discuss, the first one is talking about the bridge project at Stag Hollow Creek. And then the second item is a discussion about the master plan. And then the third item, which should be, that one's more of a brief discussion or update and to get some guidance, is about maintenance of the corridor. And that's going to be the easier one. And so where I was really hoping to start with is on the bridge project at Stag Hollow Creek. And the big question, as the board knows, we did receive correspondence from ODOT and from state parks, notification of termination of the grants associated with making that bridge happen. The ODOT termination, of course, requesting payback on the amount that they've reimbursed, on expenses to date. They did not have a date. Again, they're willing and provided in the notice that they're available to discuss repayment options and establish a repayment plan for the dispersed funds. State Parks, on the other hand, on their letter, they actually sent us an invoice for the full amount that they had reimbursed for the project, and that's $56,250. So the first part is discussing next steps. I did ask Carrie to communicate both to ODOT and State Parks to advise that we had this work session scheduled for today, to make sure that we were at least communicating our intention and not getting radio silence from us in response to these letters. So Carrie did respond and let them know that we were having this work session to have that, that we were going to have this discussion today. So specifically with the grants, and I know I gave you the number for the state parks for that amount, to date, under ODOT and looking at records, it looks like we had been reimbursed, and it's in the letter too. I want to make sure the numbers. It does. It's $687,532.78 is what they have reimbursed the county for expenses incurred. And then we still have an additional $282,192.76 of expenses that we've incurred that we have not received reimbursement for. So I just wanted to, I'm going to throw out a lot of numbers here, but so then you have a general idea of the liabilities associated with not only the grant repayment, but then these are also expenses that we incurred related to this project that we will have to address with a budgetary action to move funds into Fund 4161. Because again, this was a reimbursement grant, and so we did not budget any revenue to that line. We budgeted the anticipated reimbursements coming in on these grants, and so we still have the full liability for the expenses and the payments to Farline and the consultant that did the design work. So we still have, we still have to figure out the revenue and shifting funds in to cover these expenses. Further adding to that, so that's the grant portion of it. And I don't have anything prepared today for the board to take action on as far as what funds we're going to, what I'm going to recommend, where we pull funds and how we move funds into 4161. I think that's a discussion for a later board session once I am able to do more of I have some thoughts, but I don't have the documents prepared on where we have funds available to move in for this liability. The second part for the costs associated to the bridge project is also around the demobilization, or what we're going to do with that, with the bridge site and the construction site. So there's a question, Carrie did reach out and had a conversation with Farline Construction that was doing the bridge project, and they did give us some estimates on a couple of options on what demobilization looks like, but also keep in mind that there's also going to be some environmental aspects of this that we'll have to take into consideration as well, because what does it mean to, the abutments in particular is one thing, because those have been poured and they're in place on both sides of the creek. And so depending on the direction that we're given, if we're going to remove everything associated to the bridge and return it back to more of a natural, pre-construction condition, there's going to be costs associated with the various options that, again, that's going to further add to the cost of the project, and another item that we'll have to move funds into 4161 to cover those expenses. And the quotes and at the various options, the first option, which is, removing the slabs from the site, the bridge crossings, the mobilization costs for getting the equipment there to remove the, all of the materials that have been staged there, including the 2 large beams that are on site, and then getting those, again, removed from the site. We're looking at a cost around $73,000. If we're going to also remove and dispose of the concrete abutments, that's an additional $37,500 in cost. And then if we're going to remove the abutments, all the materials that haven't been installed yet, and remove and dispose of the piles, or address the piles that were driven into the ground, that's going to be another $8,500 in cost. So again, we're looking at just over $100,000 and some in costs and I can share these quotes depending on the direction that we're getting.
Thank you. Commissioner Bershauer, you had a question, and welcome Carrie and friend.
Thank
Commissioner
you, Chair. Ken, it's my understanding from neighboring property owners that a lot of the materials have already been removed, and Farline has gone in and well, it's probably a good week, was removing materials. I don't know if that means that they removed things that were fixed into the ground, but it seems like they've already done a lot of that work. So how is that being paid for?
Carrie, did you want to?
Sure. No, actually, those had nothing to do with any remediation or it was just the demobilization. So they had some of their own equipment out there that, they were waiting to see what the county would decide, but they needed to use those for their own purposes. So they were told that they could go remove the things that were theirs that they needed.
And I'll just say the main thing there's still some work that has to occur at the site as part of our permitting and some of the environmental. There's some erosion control and some other plantings that also need to occur at the site. We haven't given the green light to Farline to go ahead and do that yet because we wanted to have this discussion today, but that is something that we are going to have to get accomplished here in pretty short order, because typically the planting season and getting things established, it's right now. As far as a lot of the materials that were being removed, really the quote and the numbers that I'm giving you is about, it's the 4 large slabs, it's the beams and the abutments, which this is going to require 50-ton cranes. It's going to require some pretty substantial equipment to move in, to mobilize to the site just to remove those items. Because again, the slabs that are on site, those are and the beams, those were the span of the bridge. And so they're pretty substantial, and that's what we're looking at for, it's really about removing those items in the abutments. And then whatever other restoration work we need to do for slope stabilization, erosion control, anything else that may be related to the environmental permitting.
Okay. Chair, I just have a follow-up.
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner.
So I'm confused because I was told by one of the property owners along the trail right there that Farline came, I believe it was like the first week of March, and they moved in equipment and they were removing anything that wasn't attached. So is that, and I'm assuming that that's county property, correct? I mean, it's technically things that we've paid for to build the bridge. So what happened to all that, and who paid for that to happen? And then they did indicate that they would be back for the larger pieces, but I guess I'm confused as to what's been removed already and what isn't, and how it's been paid for.
Thank you. Carrie?
Sure, we can I'd be happy to get an itemized list of what was removed, but there were a number of supplies that were on site for which we had not been billed. So I think that once a decision is made as to how to proceed, then we can make sure that we line up those items in terms of which things the county would like to retain ownership of versus which things would like to be sold back to Farline if they're interested.
Yes, they did present some options in that, especially with the slabs and the beams, some buyback that, they did submit a proposal about doing a buyback for up to 80% of the county's costs associated with those materials.
So as far as that buyback option we're looking at 80% of what that $73,000?
No, because that would be the material costs, right, Chair?
That material.
Okay, so that particular material, and we don't have an estimate on what that would look like. Carrie? Probably not at this time. We don't have,
Sorry, no, we don't have an
Okay.
estimate on that, although they've been very responsive. So the minute you want to have that that alignment and those list of those choices, they provide that.
okay, thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Kula?
Thank you, Chair. One question I would have, I don't recall from our previous conversations about this, about what the cost, the total cost would be to actually put those beams and slabs in place. And I realize that that may be a bit irrelevant, because if we're not doing the conditional use permit, then we can't finish the bridge. But it's just for budgetary mental math. What would it cost to finish the bridge versus this complete demobilization?
Carrie, do you have an idea, or Ken, does that figure pop into your head?
I don't know if I necessarily have what that big, I mean,
I think it's
recall-
hard to guess at this point. So if we were to look at what is the expense of completing the project versus the expense of demobilizing, it's hard to nail down, because we have continued to incur some expenses since the stoppage of work. So for instance, we had two invoices that I sent to be processed today, one for $41,000 to Farline and one for like $1,500. So it's hard to guess at this point where we've gone off track. So I kind of have to recalculate that.
Thank you. Along the lines of Commissioner Kula, because I asked this question last time we discussed this, is what about completing the project? In completing the project, I know the answer was basically you can't have it both ways. So in completing the project, where would we come down on a decision that has been made in terms of just completing the project and leaving it as such for the time being?
yeah, I think the limitations that we have, I mean, we could reach out to Farline and get an estimate on what it would cost to, again, you know, because then a lot of the materials that they demobilized, and then the equipment mobilization costs and everything associated with that, you know, in moving, you know, because based on the decision that was made and kind of the status of things with the land use and knowing that we couldn't proceed, our approach with Farline has, you know, the only quote that we have is on really restoration of the area, not what if we were to build the bridge, but we could reach out to Farline and ask for that.
Absolutely. I think that the thing that we will see a significant difference in is that when we structured the original budget and the contract agreements, it was to maximize efficiencies. And so we've lost that. So it would certainly cost more at this point to re-enter and to complete the bridge than it would have to 3 months ago.
Okay, understood. Commissioner Bershauer, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Chair. So ODOT has reimbursed 687 some thousand. We've spent unreimbursed, we've spent 282,000. So that's roughly $970,000 that we've incurred. What was the total grant again for Connect 6?
Actually, we've spent just over 1,025,985, because that includes both the 56,000 that we had gotten reimbursement from ODOT or from state parks, in addition to ODOT.
The
Okay,
original Connect Oregon grant was for $1,012,186.
Okay, so there's no other grants that provided funding for the construction of the bridge?
No, at the time that we received the RTP grant for $75,000, of which we were reimbursed the allowable portion up to this point, it more than covered anticipated costs.
Okay, but we still didn't have a bridge. So we've already gone over budget and we still did not have a complete bridge. What
Yes,
was the,
however, the work stoppage is what really significantly impacted that. So our original numbers and our original budget was contingent upon the original construction plan. And that was hindered significantly, and costs went up assuredly.
yes, which was my argument of why we should not have constructed a bridge before we had land use, before we were through the land use process. My next question is, what is the latest $41,000 invoice from Farline for?
So there's a detailed estimate of that, but let's see, Ken, I don't know if you have received that yet.
I haven't seen that.
Okay, let me pull that up. So the current invoice is for the period between January 1st through the 28th of February. And so there's, there was a number of ongoing activities that we told them that they were authorized to continue to do. So they needed to maintain, for instance, the erosion control. They just had to do all those pieces. So I can send you this invoice if you'd like to see how that money shakes out. They're really they're very small, but again, they had to remobilize. So most of these are around moving construction equipment in and out of the site. So for instance, there was a $4,000 charge for bringing whatever equipment it was that they needed to bring to remove items recently. And then there's some management oversight. So I will send that to you right now.
Thank you.
Wanted to go back to the question that we were talking about and this might be a Christian question, and that has to do with completion of the bridge and where that puts us in the overall scheme of things in terms of, what we can do going forward.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the issues around that. That was the argument that we made to LUBA last year, is that our construction of the bridge was separate from the trail, that the trail wouldn't open until such time as we had the necessary approvals, and that we didn't need additional approvals from LUBA to complete construction. LUBA disagreed with us on that point, and if I'm speaking out of turn, I'll look to Todd to correct me, but in my understanding, the two became connected in that process. We've now withdrawn the application, which means that we've essentially withdrawn construction of the bridge under that land use process, would be my estimation of that. Not to say that we couldn't move forward to complete construction, but I think the only way we could realistically do that is if we had buy-in and the agreement of the adjacent landowners and the opponents to the trail to allow for that construction to take place. Otherwise, I would anticipate that we might get challenged again, and then they might return to LUBA and ask LUBA, or they're the only appropriate regulatory body I can think of it off the top of my head, to stop construction again if they think that we're now in some way, shape, or form trying to continue work that was withdrawn when we withdrew our application. If we could get agreement and we could strike an understanding with the opponents that they won't object to our completion of the bridge, then I think it's possible. The other layer to that is because there is now no plan to continue moving forward with development of the bridge and opening it to the public, I would still expect that ODOT would look to be reimbursed. So whatever we spent would be our own money.
Todd?
I don't disagree with what he said. We did follow our best legal judgment at the time that we had rights as a property owner to access our own property for maintenance and fire control without opening it for a trail. Those are the arguments we made, and we didn't appeal to the Court of Appeals, so we are stuck with that. At the same time, the board has now decoupled the bridge from the conditional use permit by ending the conditional use process. So that circumstance is different, and it could be that the bridge could be completed for access to our own property, but not for trail purposes, obviously, unless we reopen a conditional use process for the trail.
Thank you. Carrie, did you want to jump in here? Okay. So, all right, well, that brings some clarity to the fact that we can no longer, consider them one and the same. Commissioner Kula.
Oh, I actually raised my hand, and then I think you really said it, which is that I think we both noted that they're now, Councilor Sadlow noted really that they're now decoupled because the bridge and there's no conditional use permit active. Does that change anything associated with completing construction of the bridge? And I just ask that because if we, we have the materials on site. I know from trying to walk on the corridor that there are obstructions from the south, and that maintaining the corridor is greatly hindered by not having a bridge there.
Okay, thank you for that. So at this point, we have to make a decision in terms of what our options are regarding Commissioner Berschauer.
Sorry, Chair, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just wanted to get in the queue. You want to finish your thought? This question is for Ken or Carrie. Do we know exactly what needs to be done for erosion control, and who governs that? Is that something that Farline knows, or is that another agency that we're responding to where we have to do that work?
It'll be twofold. I would say that one, we're going to work closely with Farline and also with Dow on the permitting that was pulled. But then we also have a contact at ODOT that under the acquisition process and the NEPA process that we had to go through with acquiring the corridor. There's, we have a contact at ODOT that we work with that's an expert on the permitting and what would be required in these circumstances.
Okay, so we will be required to do something. It's not just, we're trying to tidy up and leave it how it was. We're actually required to do some mitigation.
That is some questions that are out there on whether or not, what decommissioning would we be okay in leaving the abutments in place? That's a question we still have to get answered. But there is some, revegetation, in the riparian area, any disturbances or potential erosion issues that could enter into Stag Hollow Creek. We have to address that. Right now, there's a lot of temporary measures that were installed to help control any runoff from the construction debris but this would be more of a permanent long-term fix that would probably involve everything from hydro seeding to planting or maybe even putting in some other erosion control structures. I don't know specifically what's going to be needed out there, but Farline will have a really good idea, and then we will have to consult to make sure that we stay in compliance around the environmental permitting.
Also, depending upon the relationship between the county and Federal Highways Administration acquisition grant. So if we maintain our compliance under the rules of that contract, then we are required to meet the NEPA requirements that would be outlined by ODOT. If that is no longer the case, then those requirements are much different.
But there still be some other requirements. I'm not
there
sure.
Absolutely would be.
Around DEQ or DSL requirements and working in riparian areas and wetlands.
Okay. I think Commissioner Kula had his hand up, but real quick, is there a way, it seems like we could get an estimate, fairly accurate estimate of what Farline might buy back from us just based on our material cost if they're saying they will give us 80% of it. So is there a way to pull that number together? Because I think that would it would help to know just what kind of number we're talking about to offset some of this going forward.
If I'm reading it correctly, because I mean, it is in here, I just want to make sure I'm not, again, I want to be very careful that I'm not misinterpreting what's in the invoice,
Right.
or not the invoice, but the proposal. And if I'm understanding it correctly, it looks like the cost to date on the slabs and the rail was right around 89,000. And so their estimate that the 80% buyback would be about 71,000. I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. So, you know, I just want to put that caveat on there that I could be misinterpreting on what's in this document.
But Carrie mentioned that this would be a fairly easy number to get once
Yes.
we've asked them exactly what we're looking for.
Mhm.
Commissioner Kula?
Thank you, Chair. I guess I wanted to ask the question then again of Councillor Sadlow. Is there any way, or what would be a mechanism to complete the bridge construction now that we're not coupled to a conditional use permit?
Well, I don't know exactly. I would have to look more closely at it, but it really would be better, as Christian said, if we did not have opponents to it. And perhaps we don't have opponents because there's no conditional use permit pending. But otherwise, I'd need to take a close look before I could give you legal advice about it.
So just to your point, Todd, about basically access on our property for fire and emergency vehicles being sort of one of the rationales early on, is that not enough of a rationale to complete the project in terms of, and let's say there is other grant funding out there from ODOT or whatever, but just that specific the relationship of it being the county's property and access for emergency vehicles.
Commissioner, I think so, but I've been obviously wrong before. If a farmer were out building this bridge to get to his farm field, Yamhill County would not require a permit. It's not within the floodplain, so we don't need a floodplain permit. In my view, we don't need a permit. But because we had a conditional use permit pending that talked about the bridge, LUA said that it was tied to the trail and that we could not complete the bridge without completing the conditional use process, which we decided not to do on remand. So that's where we are right now.
So just a hypothetical, and it involves going into the Wayback Machine and being able to change the past, which we can't. But if we had not started that project, in other words, if we had not started that project until we had crossed the T's, dotted the I's type of thing, would we, well, obviously we wouldn't be in this position, but basically a decision that we made thinking that we were going to be able to cross the T's and dot the I's got us to where we are now because we didn't anticipate that there were going to be the types of challenges that were ongoing. Would that be a safe way to sum it up?
Commissioner, no, we and Madam Chair, we just did not expect to lose.
There you go.
There you go.
And,
Thank you, Todd. Commissioner Kula.
thank you, Chair. And Todd, can you remind me who provided that counsel to the county around that we can build a bridge on our own land? I'm trying to remember who we heard that from.
You probably heard it from me, but I conferred with Ken Friday about it and asked him if there was anything. We specifically had our engineering firm file a letter of map amendment to make it clear to FEMA that it was outside of the floodplain. And in our view, that was the only permit that was required if we were just building a bridge and not letting the public onto it. So what we said in the CUP decision was that the public cannot come onto the bridge until the master plan is in place, and that it can only be used for maintenance and fire control until that time. That's the argument that failed at LUBA, and that's all I have to say about it.
Carrie, thank you, Todd. Carrie.
I was just going to add that we did have a number of conversations with our partners at ODOT, including the Department of Justice, and it was their opinion that this was an excellent and very reasonable approach to take to completing this project.
Thank you for that. So that being said, if they were, I guess, complicit or in agreement that this was okay moving forward when all the red flags were going off. I remember the day we approved this. Well, the other commissioners approved it. And I said, I don't know, you guys, this might put us in some jeopardy if this thing doesn't fly, and we might be liable for paying it back. So I was concerned about this particular project specifically. So I'm wondering, since ODOT, DOJ said, yeah, you're good to go, whether or not we might look to them for some remediation of these fees that have to be paid back.
Madam Chair, I was not relying on their legal advice. I was doing my own research and just asking them what they thought of those arguments, and they thought those arguments were good.
So, but wouldn't that be a good argument, because they said, yeah, it looks like you guys are good to go, that when it comes time for any kind of repayment, that we look at how they weighed in?
Madam Chair, I don't see how we can rely on their legal advice, and I certainly did not rely on their legal advice. I relied on my own research and my discussions with Ken Friday to come to a conclusion that the bridge could go forward as long as it was not open to the public as a trail until the final conditions of the conditional use permit were satisfied.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that we did hear from ODOT last summer, late spring, early summer, that they were considering terminating our agreement because we were having land use difficulties. We spent a great deal of time and energy working with ODOT to try and address those concerns. By December of last year, we essentially had agreement with ODOT that we had a new timeline. And I think it's important to remember that their demand for payback now is not tied to the fact that we've not managed to succeed at LUBA so far, or that LUBA has so far said you can't build the bridge. Their request for payback is tied to the fact that we withdrew the application. If we had left the application in place, if we had moved forward with the remand, if we could have managed to obtain county approval of the application again, ODOT, at least at the time, was still willing to partner with us and move this project forward.
So as far as the timeline, because that was always a consideration, that was always one of the arguments against these projects, was if we can't do it, we're going to be penalized for this and be liable for repayment. So if at that time we didn't fight for an extension, would that termination have resulted in us being responsible for repayment since they terminated?
Madam,
Yeah, I mean, if they had, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christian.
I mean, yeah, if they had proceeded with the termination, then we would have had to decide whether or not we felt that they had a legitimate basis under the contract with which to terminate, and we could have potentially challenged that, or otherwise, if we had challenged it and their basis for termination had been upheld, then yes, we would have been in a position that we would have had to pay back the amounts that had been reimbursed so far.
Madam Chair, LUBA specifically found that this project could meet the standards. It just has not to date met the standards. They gave us another roadmap for how to meet those standards, and it could have been done if it wasn't terminated, I believe. And Luba also apparently believes that it can be done.
So then, correct me if I'm wrong, this would then entail continuing to stand up against ongoing litigation at our expense. Is that reasonable to say? Because we know that the opponents have made it clear that they would continue to litigate, so that if we had decided to continue this, despite, and we, again, met all the requirements that Luba suggested, we would then be in ongoing litigation at our expense. Is that correct?
I don't know that. I mean, you call it litigation. It's an administrative process before the Land Use Board of Appeals. And really, it's a local process right now because it was remanded to the county. To the extent that they, I guess, could go to the Court of Appeals, it's never gone there. They keep winning. Maybe that's why. But I don't know what. I don't have a crystal ball to decide to advise you on whether or not they would keep litigating, or whether people on the pro side will litigate the county for terminating this project and taking other steps to make the project impossible.
Thank you, Todd. Commissioner
Always a risk
Bershauer.
of litigation.
Thank you, Todd. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. I think we already know the answer to that question. They told us at the last trail hearing where we decided to withdraw the application. So, and the message was very clear that they will continue to litigate. One of my questions though is I have a really hard time believing that we don't need a permit to place such an expansive bridge over a creek with all of the DEQ and riparian rules and environmental impacts and all of that. How is it that we don't need a permit to place something like this over a waterway? That is,
We have an engineering firm.
Excuse me?
Commissioner, we have an engineering firm that's making sure that we complied with every applicable law. And that's what we did. We looked for every applicable law, including the floodplain, the fact that at the time it was in a floodplain. And we petitioned to FEMA and got their decision that the floodplain map was wrong and that the site was not within the floodplain. That was one of the last things that we needed. We had all the environmental approvals that were required for this and all the environmental review that was required. We had biologists out there. We had engineers looking at the water course, and this was all obviously it was all done in accordance with law, other than it was tied by the opponents to the conditional use permit, and we could not untie it from that, even though we pledged not to let the public use it until the master plan was in place, the signage was in, everything was done. The fencing, all of the fencing.
Okay, I'm just talking about going forward, even if they're untied now, it blows my mind that you don't need a permit to place.
No, you don't. Unless you're the county.
Thank you, Todd. Christian?
Yeah, and Todd, if I remember right, wasn't that also in part due to the fact that we have not historically required property owners who would be in similar situations with a desire to build a bridge on their own property like this to obtain a permit?
Correct. If you're in the floodplain, you do have to have an engineer's certificate stating that you won't have a net rise of 1 foot if it's in the floodplain, or a no net rise if it's in the floodway. And very often bridges are in the floodplain or the floodway.
Sorry.
But beyond
Christian,
that, the county's practice was not to require permits.
That's correct. It still is the practice.
Okay. For a regular property owner.
Sorry, Lindsay.
You don't need to get a building permit. There are no building permits issued for bridges. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Bershauer.
Sorry, the screen froze, and so I didn't hear what Christian said for a minute. when Christian, when you first started
Oh.
responding.
I was just asking Todd, because I'd heard this discussed previously, that it has and remains the county's practice not to require permits from property owners who look to build a bridge on their own property unless it's in the floodway or the floodplain.
And they will commonly do that. They can get railroad bed, car beds. I'm not sure what you call it. You can put a bridge in. You don't need to ask the county about it unless you are in a flood plain. And if you are, you have to show that there's no more than 1 foot net rise in the base flood, the 100-year flood. And if you're in the floodway, you have to show that there is no net rise. And you have to get an engineer's certificate to do that. That requires a permit from the planning department. But otherwise, no building permit or other permit required for you to put a structure across a waterway, as long as the footings and no part of it are in the floodplain or the floodway.
And we were able to establish that that was the case with this bridge.
That is the case with this bridge.
Okay.
And we got all the other environmental and approvals because we were using ODOT money.
Right.
Commissioner Kula.
And thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Bershauer, believe me, I was surprised to learn the same thing too, which made me, it actually informed me in my own, on my own farm actually, because we own property on 2 sides of a waterway. So it was really helpful to know that it's really about the floodway and the floodplain. For us, it's the floodway.
Mm.
Okay. Commissioner Kula, did you have something else?
No, Chair. I do think that, I think that it would be valuable to try to find a way to finish this construction project, knowing how important it is to have access to one's property. And it does seem like there's a path forward. I do wonder, I think it would be helpful though, in future conversations, to know really what it would cost to get Farline there, put those down.
So really, I guess if the question is, would the opponents be amenable to just the completion of the bridge, or is that a non-starter? Commissioner Bershauer?
Thank you, Chair. It's my understanding that they are not amenable to that, but I will go back to the entire purpose of the grant. The purpose of the grant was to design multiple bridges that would be needed for the trail, as well as construct one of them. So this thing was never sold as being just an access bridge. It was part of the Yamhilla's West Sider Trail. And I think to try and separate them and finish it under a completely different pretense is wrong. That would be wrong of us to do.
Well, I will go back to the description of what this was sold to us as, which was a description of it being for use for emergency vehicles and access for emergency vehicles and fire in that corridor. So that's the way it was initially sold, because that being the sort of the base code of the rationale, again, I had concerns and I had questions, but that was one of the reasons that's one of the selling points. Carrie?
I just wanted to
Okay,
clarify a
that
couple
was
of
one.
things. Oh, Christian.
No, I was just going
wanted
to
to-
confirm. Yeah. Go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to clarify that it is not multiple bridges. There is one bridge and likely 2 culverts. And so that's the grand distinction, but also to clarify one of Commissioner Kula's points, which is to say that there is actually no access whatsoever to the corridor without the bridge and the 2 culverts, period.
Thank you for that. Christian?
I was just going to say, I recall similar conversations in the beginning that one of the bases and one of the benefits of constructing this bridge in the manner it was designed was to be able to accommodate emergency vehicles for fire and safety access. So I would agree that that's been a part of the conversation from the very beginning.
That's correct. You know, the bridge design elements, just like Christian was saying, that even if the primary purpose long-term was to accommodate trail pedestrian, you know, trail usage, but there is that secondary purpose for any bridge that it like this would also serve to support any maintenance or ongoing emergency needs or things along those lines. Otherwise, it'd be a much different bridge, you know, if it was just strictly a pedestrian bridge.
Thank you. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I find this conversation incredibly disingenuous because the entire point of the Connect 6 grant agreement was to facilitate the development of the Yamhilla's West Sider Trail. And that involved a very large bridge that conveniently is now being argued that we need it for access when the county, outside of any sort of Yamhilla's West Sider Trail development effort, would never have paid or asked for money to build a bridge just for access to the 3-mile stretch between Carlton and Yamhill. So I find this conversation very disingenuous. It might be convenient for the sake of not needing a permit to continue bridge construction, but that is not what the public understands about the purpose of these grants. The purpose was for the development of the trail.
That's
Thank
why
you. Christian?
the back.
And I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. I wasn't trying to disagree with that. I agree with you. It was the original intent behind the grant. The original description of the project was to design these bridges and build one of them in expectation of this trail being completed and at some point opened up to the public. So if that's the sense you got from what we were saying, that's certainly not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to say now that we're changing the basis for why this bridge is potentially worth building or not. It's always been, from the beginning of the Connect 6, it was intended to be part of the trail. When it became clear that it was going to be difficult and we were running into timelines, there was another avenue that we thought might be open to us to complete the bridge. But again, even at that point, I don't think it was discussed that we were only building it at that point for our own purposes. It would only be open and used for our own purposes and wouldn't ever be open to the public until such time as the trail was completed. So it's been sort of conceptualized that even though we might have completed construction before we had the conditional use permit, it wouldn't have been open to the public until such time as the conditional use permit was granted. But there was still sort of the ongoing hope and expectation that we might eventually get to that point. So I appreciate, the argument and the distinction, and we can continue to have this conversation for as long as folks want to continue it. But I don't know that it's helping sort of further the conversation that we're trying to have today in terms of what is it that the board would like to see done with the property and the bridge going forward.
Thank you. I agree, but I just want to say, having been there for these discussions, that was one of the selling points. Not that it was superseding what the intent of this bridge was. Everybody knew what that was, but one of the selling points was it could also be used to access for emergency vehicle access. So right now we've got some questions before us, and that is, but I think we need some more information, and that would be from Farline in terms of an estimate. And Carrie, you said that's pretty easy for us to pretty easy.
Yes.
To get.
You want the estimate for them to restart the project? You want them to rescope from this point forward?
Well, if we were also going to get figures for some of the dollar figures for buyback.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they would be happy to comply with that. We can get a full project estimate from this point forward that includes any buyback options.
Okay, great.
And I did forward the estimate that Farline, I did forward that estimate to the commissioners. So you have that information on what was provided.
All right, so that's good information, and I don't think that we can move forward at this point with more until we get that information, and that will inform further discussions. Other commissioners are seeing it that way, or there's more to discuss on this? Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think Ken was hoping for some direction from us. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like, according to Ken's numbers, it's about 120,000 or so to clean, quote unquote, clean up the bridge and remove things. If Farline is offering 80% of whatever that number was, that's roughly 70,000. So you're talking about maybe $50,000 to, if you're talking in net numbers, to clean up the materials and do the erosion control and put it back to the way it was. I would argue that it's not going to cost $50,000 to complete the bridge as it currently sits. So, you know, I don't know how much more discussion we need on the numbers. It seems pretty clear to me.
Well, I think any of this information informs decisions. I understand, Commissioner, what you're saying, but I think that if we have hard numbers, we can go ahead and look at some options. Again, they seem limited. I'll grant you that. It seems like we don't have an awful lot of options at this point, but we do have options, and this is a big project. And I'd hate to see us just, you know, without looking at every possible way of addressing this. I think we need to do some due diligence. I'm not saying I'm going to be the last person who's going to defend something that I thought really was of concern early on. What I'm saying is that now, you know, as I am fond of saying, you know, it doesn't matter how the donkey got in a ditch. Well, it does matter. I think that past boards have not looked at some of the ramifications of this, and now we're dealing with it. But the donkey's in the ditch. Now we have to get the donkey out. What is going to be the least harm that we do to the county in terms of budget? I'm looking at that. I think this whole thing is really is so disturbing and so regrettable, and I feel, and I've said it again, said it before, that I feel now it's now on those who are opposed to this, when there have been red flags and concerns raised all along. If we had just, you know, maybe put the brakes on, but now we haven't, and now here we are. So I'm trying to see how do we mitigate the damage that is forthcoming. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to make it clear too, though, that if for some reason the idea on the table is to move forward with completing the bridge, we are still going to owe ODOT money back. They are not just going to cut us a check for $680,000 to build an access bridge for the county. So you're talking about the questionable expense that we're discussing now, plus considerable expense to finish the bridge. So I just wanted to make that clear as well.
Well, I also wanted to go back to the question of their being in some way involved in where we find ourselves, because they knew what our situation was, and they knew about LUBA, they knew about the remands, they knew about the ongoing litigation. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to them, and nevertheless they said, you know, go forth and do what you said you were going to do. It's not like it was news to them. So maybe they have some buy-in on this too. Ken?
And I just want to clarify that we've already incurred the expense of over $1 million on what's been completed, as far as, and that includes everything from the design elements to the construction that was completed to date. So we've already incurred the expense. We've just been reimbursed around $743,000, just over that amount, from ODOT and state parks towards what has already been spent, those expenses we've already incurred. Thank
you, Ken. So to your point, Commissioner Bershauer, I'm not suggesting that this is the route that we go. I would like to have some information so that at the end of the day, we can look at a balance sheet. And what I said early on, almost 7 years ago, is we're not keeping track of how much the county is spending. There's no, you know, there was definitely no line item in a budget. There was no keeping track of staff time or expenses. It was just a write the checks as the bills came in. And I thought, well, that's no way to do business. You need to have a cost. What's it going to cost? What's it going to cost to maintain? We never had that. Now we've been keeping track. So there's that piece, but there's also the information that comes when we have a list of this is what it's going to cost, and these are what, at the end of the day, what the options are. So we're not just voting on something without all of the specifics. Commissioner Kula?
Yes, thank you. Chair, did you finish what you were going to say? Okay. Thank you for that. And obviously, it's very important to track the expenses. My understanding is that the county, I mean, we'd be not in compliance with all of our grants and funding if we weren't keeping track of the expenses involved. But did you mean staff time, Commissioner or Chair?
So early on, in the very beginning of this, before there was this sort of stream of grants, I was asking, what have we spent? What has the county spent here to date? What has the county spent with matches or with initial investments or staff time? Staff time is not insignificant, and nobody knew. There was nobody keeping track of those expenses until I had asked at that time Administrator Shopbold, can we start tracking this so that everybody's putting in what they're spending the staff time is got to be considered in all this. So at least we can say this is what this project is costing. So I'm not necessarily talking about grants. I'm talking about the whole project.
Thank you, Chair.
So Ken, I know that's not giving you any direction, but my recommendation is, and I'm not in any way suggesting that we go ahead and necessarily complete a bridge for a project that we know is going to have ongoing litigation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is, what do we do? What's the least amount of damage we can do?
And we can get that information. Again, this is a work session, so we weren't necessarily looking for a specific, unless there was a specific action item that came out of this that would go on the agenda for later in this session. So we're essentially looking for consensus of the board because there's a lot of question marks, because we didn't have this information about, and we can get this. We'll reach out to Farline, we'll get an estimate, and then we can come back and have that discussion on, and so you can look at the two options, everything that, that decommissioning the bridge plus all the incurred expense that we've already had up to this point, what that's going to look like, and then also what it would look like in comparison if we had asked to finish the bridge, and we can get that information.
Okay, great. So Commissioner Kula, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. Just bringing this back to bridge or no bridge, trail or no trail. Again, we don't have access to this section of the property, and there are a lot of ways that we can achieve that. In the Public Works has a little storage area off of Hill Road where they have the old Sheridan Road footbridge, for example. We do need to be able to access that area. And so I just want to, point that out, is that at some point we just need to make a decision too about how we're going to access that.
And that's one of the questions that I hope we can answer through this. It's worth discussing. Do we want to move on to the master plan? Ken, does that seem?
Yeah, I think at this point, because again, this is related to the bridge, but not necessarily the decommissioning, but with the current grants, it is going to be something that I'm going to have to prepare budget, a transfer for funds into 4161 to cover the expenses, because we do need to, while ODOT, we still need to have conversations on what repayment's going to look like under that grant agreement. We do have an invoice that has a due date of April 3rd with Oregon Parks to pay that portion back. And because we're not anticipating getting any more reimbursement for expenses, in fact, we're being asked to pay back or refund a reimbursement that we received, we're going to need to make sure that we have revenue funding sources in that fund to cover these expenses.
Ken, what's the state parks amount?
$56,260.
Oh, okay, I see that. Thank you. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. So if we gather information and then put this on the agenda for next week, does that give you enough time to figure that out in terms of at least the state parks one?
Mhm.
And then when is the ODOT conversation happening?
Well, again, the communication that once we received the notice on March 8th, our communication was we have a work session scheduled for today. Or the letter was dated March 8th. I'm not sure when we actually received it. I don't see a date stamp, but our communication was we have a work session, and then that would spur the conversation moving forward with ODOT. Because if you recall from the previous discussions that we had with ODOT, what I want to be careful with is, I don't want to suddenly they're withholding other payments from ODOT to other departments, that they're withholding funds to Public Works as an example because of this outstanding. So there is something that we'll want to start having those conversations with ODOT. And, again, we had it in a holding pattern until we were able to have this work session today.
Okay. Can commissioners be a part of those conversations?
At least one of you can, unless we declare it as a public meeting. And if more than one want to be there, then we'll just notice it, and then we could have, similar to when we had Mr. Chickering come. We could possibly invite ODOT to attend a meeting to have that conversation. Otherwise, certainly a commissioner at a time could participate in those conversations, I would think.
Okay, I would like to participate. So, whenever that conversation happens and however it happens, I don't know about my fellow commissioners, but I would like to be a part of that conversation.
Would it be appropriate for them to join in the board session so that we could make it part of a formal, already noticed meeting? Or is that too much inside baseball?
Well, I think it's a question on, this is kind of if it's going to be a negotiation or a repayment schedule. I mean, it's up to if, we can ask ODOT to attend possibly a work session to have a discussion on what repayment options would look like,
Would that be an executive session?
You could have a general session if you wanted to have a more open conversation, and then if the board wanted to go into executive session to discuss further, I think we could do that.
I think it would be really instructive for all the commissioners to be part of these discussions, and maybe the safest way to facilitate that is just at a formal informal.
Yeah.
Does council have any concerns about that?
No, like I said, if we get into too many details or we get into, financial considerations, budgetary concerns, or, liability risk issues, we could set those aside and have a discussion about some or all of that in executive session if it qualifies.
All right, thank you. So do we want to discuss master plan?
Do you have a particular, if we're talking about inviting ODOT, who does the board think might be the most appropriate person to ask to attend? Mr. Chickering or someone else from the program office, or who did the letter come from, Carrie?
Cooper Brown.
Cooper.
So is that something that their council might be?
I mean, that's the office of the director. It's Cooper Brown who signed the letter and the notice. So it comes from the director of ODOT.
Yeah.
Well, I think it would be up to them to decide who they want to come and be the representative for this discussion. Okay.
Chair, I agree. I would appreciate hearing from the director's office, though, and having the opportunity to ask questions. So maybe we invite them.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the master plan and discussion on the master plan, because this is a big piece of this, and it's also maybe one of the most contentious elements of this decision. So thoughts about the master plan. Carrie, do you want to maybe give us the where we're at with that in terms of our contract and what we've put them pretty much in abeyance at this point, correct?
Yes. So our original agreement was for approximately a 10 to 12 month process. And we stopped after the last Board of Commissioners meeting in which Alta presented technical memos 1 and 2, just to get the approval and to make sure that the board felt that they were moving in the right direction. We have not had any further conversations because we did not want to incur any additional expenses towards ODOT. So we've been waiting to see what that would look like. Our actual contract, I believe, expires in June of this year. So we would, at this point, we would need to file an extension or request an extension in any case.
So none of the work, so basically we have all of the work that they have at this point contracted for per their contract and their scope of work has been accomplished. Is that right? Or did we just stop them in midstream when they were continuing these focus groups or more
Right.
input from? Okay.
We stopped midstream. Yeah, we had only convened the project advisory committee a single time. And then I just advised them, until we have some further direction, we need to stop incurring charges.
Okay, but at this point, the scope of work says that what they were contracted to do, they have done, and the only thing that's left is what was going to be continue on until June when they gave us a final report after a number of focus groups.
Yes, essentially.
Okay.
They have deliverables that are outlined in the contract. So they're required to provide a variety of additional technical memos. They have some open houses that were going to be virtual open houses. So there were a number of deliverables they were expecting to meet.
So at this point, the deliverables that they were expected to give us, they have up to this point. And is it anything other than what they shared with us at the last? Nothing different.
No, not substantially. I mean, in the general scope, there were certain things that had to be done earlier rather than later that didn't necessarily materialize in the first presentation to the board. But by and large, it was a pretty linear process, and so they stopped where you have been informed.
Okay, thank you. Thoughts, commissioners, on the master plan? Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair. So if I think that we should continue forward with the master plan, so we'll just get that out there. But if we chose not to move ahead with the master plan, is that how is that related to the Federal Highway Administration? And their acquisition grant?
So the Federal Highway Administration, through the TAP funding, is how we received the acquisition, the $1.7 million to acquire the corridor. And so that was acquired with the express purpose to create a recreational trail. So removing the conditional land use process for, or withdrawing rather, for Connect Oregon was one piece. But if the county decides not to proceed with a master plan, and that could be interpreted as a decision not to proceed with any recreational trail purpose for the corridor, which would then likely incur the conversation from FHWA about whether they'd like to request that money be paid back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Berschauer, thoughts on the master plan?
Thank you, Chair. So of the master planning total grant, what has been spent so far?
So that's a reimbursement grant. So we don't manage those invoices. Those invoices go directly to ODOT. So I have not seen what that is. I would suspect it is close to 50% based on some of the early, heavy work that had to be done by the consulting group. And the full award was for
120,000?
Yes.
And you said 50 or 15?
I said approximately 50.
Okay.
In addition to that, I would also add that we did receive a match contribution from Ken Wright for $16,000. So the county did not put that money up itself. So I believe we received a request to pay that back as well, if we do not proceed.
Chair, I just, my general thought is that I have a hard time justifying spending another $60,000 of taxpayer money on a plan for something that has already been essentially litigated through LUBA and didn't come out the other end. And so I just don't see how we can justify spending more money on something that we have a commitment from adjacent landowners that they're not going to allow it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair. And just as a reminder, the Board of Commissioners chose to not pursue a remand. So we as a board, as a majority of the board, made that decision. So this is a decision that we, again, have to make.
So as far as repayment, I think what we really need to do is get an idea, a dollar amount, when we put all these various separate grants together, get a dollar amount, and then look at some of the options and ways we can mitigate the cost to whatever degree we can.
So for TGM, we are not required to pay any of that back. So the $120,000, TGM is not going to ask the county to pay back, even if we stop the master planning process. We would be on the hook to do the $16,000 match that was provided by Ken Wright. But the larger issue is that this decision would have the byproduct of publicly stating that there is no intention to use this corridor for recreational trail purposes. And that would incur the FHWA, or could potentially incur the FHWA payback.
Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure that's correct, because in future commissions could decide to take up a master planning process again, which would not have that intended effect. So I'm not sure that just because we don't follow through with the TGM grant that suddenly we're on the hook for 1.7 million.
Well, they wouldn't look to future boards. They would look to the current board, just as they have in previous incarnations of the grant agreement. So they would say the decisions you're making now stand. And so if that puts us in violation of our original agreement, which is currently open, then yes, that would.
Right, but technically, since we're not part of the TGM grant, couldn't ODOT continue to fulfill this? Or what is it that is part of the grant that that is triggered by actions of the commission? There
are milestones that are built into the scope of work that does require elements that, just like in last December was the first one, where they made a Alta made a presentation to the board, and the board, acted on accepting what was presented at that point. So there are milestones. There is the county participation, or that requirement in it, that doing the master plan, because again, it's county owned property. They're doing a master planning process for county property. And so, the county has a critical role in that process in meeting the milestones.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Kula, I'm sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Bershauer.
I just had a follow-up question. So could we have engaged in a master planning process before we were granted the acquisition grant?
Not necessarily.
Theoretically.
You typically do not do full master plans. You'll do, because I will say that during the acquisition process, there were feasibility studies, there were environmental reviews, there was a lot of things, that's why it took a number of years to get through the process to the final acquisition. But it's not a full-on master plan process. You do that, typically you do that after you have ownership of the property, because again, the master planning process is looking at, because ownership of the corridor and alignments and how that's going to all play in, you have to have that, at least that piece delineated to a certain degree, to determine where you're going to put a trail alignment.
So was there any due diligence done before we accepted the acquisition grant, so that, knowing that we were going to be on the hook for 1.7 million potentially if this thing didn't go through, what kind of due diligence was done prior to accepting that?
Well, I think there was we're going back to, this was in discussions for years, and we're talking, and I'm trying to remember the timeline because it's starting to, we're talking 11, more than a dozen years ago, when a lot of this. And so then there was the whole application, there was a review of the corridor, there was, looking at the property. And then, like I said, earlier, as part of before any funds and before we even started negotiating with the railroad, there was all this due diligence that went into looking at the alignments, looking at the properties, looking at doing some preliminary environmental, all of those steps had to be met before we even started going into negotiations with Union Pacific for the actual acquisition of the corridor. And then there was the due diligence and all of everything that goes into any property acquisition that also goes into that. And, it was also adopted into the TSP around the time of the application for the acquisition grant, or one of the early acquisition grants. So there was due diligence. And then after acquisition, there was also a feasibility study that the county and the Friends of the Trail got a technical assistance grant with the National Park Service. And so then there was that initial feasibility study that was done after the acquisition of the property, which again, that's not a master plan. It's not a full master plan because it didn't, a master plan has several different elements and requirements associated to that specific process. But then there was also that further due diligence. And then you had the master planning process. And again, there was a grant opportunity through TGM for getting the master plan. And I'm trying to remember the timing of things with the conditional use and how that coincided, or the timing of things. But again, and if I'm, again, I'm trying to go off my memory from a dozen years ago.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to sort through what Ms. Martin said, which is if we don't proceed with the master planning grant, then it could trigger the acquisition grant. But it's my understanding that the acquisition grant treats this right of way as a transportation corridor. It's not necessarily a trail, it's a transportation corridor, because it was stated in those documents that eventually it could be used for passenger rail or light rail. So I don't see how you make the connection with, if we don't proceed with a master plan for the Yamhill West Sider Trail, that suddenly we trigger a repayment of acquisition, because it still is a transportation corridor. It theoretically could be used as a light rail, a train in the future. So I just wanted to get clear on that.
And I think there's a lot of things, and sorry, Todd, I know you want to jump in too, but there's a possibility. I don't know how Federal Highways or ODOT is going to interpret us not proceeding with this grant. It's just, the potential's there. And again, there may be a determination. They may reach out to us and think that we're, and again, that's subject to discussions. Todd, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, Commissioner, I agree. I don't think that the acquisition grant is in any way tied to these other grants. There's no immediate time limit or requirement that we develop a trail within the near future. I think we were throwing around 30 years at some point, and I'm not sure where that figure came from, but I know that we were not required to build bridges or master plan or do anything else as part of the documents that we signed. And we got fee title from Union Pacific, and we hold that title. And I don't see I agree that with Ken that you never know, But I think that the risk is very low that anybody would ever ask to have that money back, as long as it is maintained in its current as a single tax lot, which it is.
Because if you look at the TSP, as Ken mentioned, it's a multimodal transportation
there.
corridor. So
Still
nothing
all
has
there.
changed in that capacity. Okay,
Correct.
thank you. Thank you. Christian?
And just to say that is certainly something we could ask ODOT about.
Well, we in effect did, and we had Andrew Blair responded in to those questions and basically said the same thing that I'm saying now. And I think that it is because it is still in the comprehensive plan, and it still exists as a corridor that is supposed to be a rail with trail eventually, but no time limits are stated anywhere as far as I know.
Okay, that's a good point. Good point of clarification. Carrie, did you want to say something?
Sorry.
You're muted, Carrie.
Sorry, I was just saying, I'm just looking through the original agreement to see. I thought there was a time limit that was indicated. I know that the conversation, it was Eric Havig who wrote the response to the commissioner's questions, but so I'm just double checking.
Okay, thank you. Okay, those are good
And
points.
they say something in there about, a 75-year period or around that time frame where it would need to be a corridor, but I don't think that would necessitate necessarily proceeding with development of the Yamhill West Sider Trail. That 75 years.
Right, that multimodal sort of covers a multitude of possibilities. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. My previous point still stands about where I'm at on the grant, but I think for clarification, it would be nice to know how much has been reimbursed on that grant. So maybe we bring this up next week as well before we make a final decision. But I'm in favor of, telling all to continue to halt until we know exactly where we're at, and then we can make a decision. That's just my feeling.
Thank you, Carrie.
So again, we have no obligation to repay that, but we certainly could get that information from ODOT about how much expense has been incurred against the program.
Okay, good to know. So at this point, do we want to just, again, put this on the list of considerations for next week's discussion on this? If there's nothing else on the master plan that anybody wants to weigh in on, the next item would be for us to discuss maintenance.
Yeah.
And Ken.
Sorry, Chair. And for this one, because, some of the uncertainty around the next decisions, I just know that there's going to be some property management, some maintenance things that we need to do. And I don't think we're necessarily, more than anything, it's just that I just want to clear that, that we're going to have some maintenance responsibilities, for trying to keep vegetation under control in portions of the corridor. And I'm going to be working with parks to implement some of that. Again, we have the NEPA requirements that we need to comply with. And so there's going to be those communications with ODOT, but we are going to be incurring some expense associated to those activities. And I think more importantly, what I'm hoping to do is by having this discussion, as well as, if we're out there doing clearing activities, I just want it clear that we're doing maintenance. We're not continuing work on the trail or starting to do construction activities on the trail. Anything along those lines, we're trying to, there's going to be some maintenance items that we need to do on the corridor. And I just thought it would be good to talk to the board and just make it clear that we need to do some work in the corridor as far as maintaining the property. And, and again, we're trying to maintain it within reason as well. In trying to keep the corridor under control, but I don't know if I'm saying that very well, but I think it's really important before the phone calls start or the concerns come forward that that there's not a perception that we've now suddenly resumed construction on the trail or doing any other trail activities other than we need to do some maintenance out there.
Thank you
We've
for
had some
that.
requests for maintenance.
Yes. Is there any value, do you think, and I'm going to point this question to Commissioner Berschauer, to find a liaison with the adjacent landowners and say, is there somebody that we could sort of have on speed dial who would be the point person to discuss some of these concerns about, okay, we're going to be out there with a crew doing maintenance, or we have some concerns about this one particular item that Farline needs to remove. I mean, so that we have somebody who's embedded, who would be amenable to talking to the county about what our needs are right now, as far as we're still the property owner and we still need to maintain this property.
Sorry, Chair, are you asking me if I think it's a good idea?
Well, I'm asking you specifically if you think that there's value in reaching out to a group of people and saying, hey, is there somebody here who wants to step up and be the point person that our administrator calls or whoever calls when we need to get out there and do maintenance, or if we have any particular issues, that there is a relationship. So it's not just, because the adversarial part of this is long-standing. And if there's a way that you can, build a bridge, that's a really bad analogy, so that we have a conversation when stuff like this needs to happen to the degree that it can. And so, Commissioner Berschauer, your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Chair. I would agree. I think it's a great idea. And I haven't seen any complaints come through about other sections of the right of way, but some have come through at the kind of the northern end by Yamhill, the city of Yamhill. Adjacent landowners have said, we're having trouble with overgrown weeds and blackberries and and fence lines and all that kind of stuff. So I think it would be helpful to have a direct line of communication and just let them know that, this is a priority for us to be good neighbors and maintain what we need to while these discussions are happening, at least. So
is that something you could do, to reach out and see if there's somebody who would like to speak for the adjacent farmers?
Sure.
And then get us a point person?
Sure.
Okay.
It's unclear. Ken, what are you thinking this is going to cost? Is there a significant price tag, or is this just sort of wrapped up into regular maintenance of property that we are?
Honestly, that's to be determined, because I'm really looking at it that we're looking at just doing some regular, because I also want to keep maintenance in perspective too. We're not looking at clearing from property to property line. What we're trying to do is manage, we're trying to be good neighbors and trying to manage any nuisance, complaints that we may receive, whether it's, from the city for those, within the city of Carlton for some of those right-of-way areas. But again, I'm also trying to approach it with a reasonable, because everybody has a different idea when it comes to, what they may envision as appropriate maintenance. And we're trying to really come at it with a cost-effective and also a reasonable approach on how we're managing the vegetation, because again, a lot of these core areas, there's a reason why, we had to do a lot of clearing to get survey crews and get technical experts into the site. The railroad, when they weren't maintaining the entire corridor. And so I also want to be realistic in the expectations, that we're going to manage the vegetation at a reasonable level to try to keep things under control and keep it from spreading into the neighboring properties and address hazards and complaints as they're brought to our attention. But again, this is something that I'll be working with our parks department and working on some solutions. Again, a lot of this, because the other part that's typically part of a master plan as well is your long-term maintenance goals and vegetation. There's that element that's tied into it as well. And so there's still a lot of questions, and everybody has a different perspective when it comes to what is maintained. So.
Thank you. Commissioner Kula.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I didn't want to get in between this conversation, but I just want to note that it's important if we're going to be communicating with landowners adjacent to the trail that or to this tax lot, right, Chair? That it's 12 and a half miles long, and there's a lot of landowners adjacent to it, and there's a complicating factor, right, that not everybody who owns the land is the one managing it too. So a tenant farmer, as it were, may be managing it, and so they don't get the notice that the county is out there managing noxious weeds. And I say managing noxious weeds because I saw Luke Westfall in the audience and from Greater Yamhill Watershed Council. So I just want to make sure that if we're, I'm all for Commissioner Bershauer kind of communicating with folks adjacent to this tax lot or providing that communication line. But I really want to make sure that we're addressing everybody and not just opponents who are adjacent to the trail who have our email addresses and email us all the time, or email us when there's a concern. And I really appreciate those. We don't know that there's a concern until it's raised.
So thank you, Commissioner Kula. Commissioner Bershauer, does that seem like it would be reasonable or doable to be able to find somebody who, or even a couple of people who want to weigh in and be in communication with the county?
Thank you, Chair. Whoops. Am I still on video? Okay.
We can see you.
I was just going to ask, is that common practice for the Parks Department to notify adjacent landowners? Okay, so it's not.
No,
Well,
I mean, we typically, just like anyone else, if we have maintenance that we need to do on parks, but again, this is a unique situation. You know, but no, we typically don't do, if we're going to go mow at Grenfell Park, we don't send a notice to all the neighboring property owners. We just do our maintenance activities.
I am definitely open to it, and I agree with Commissioner Kula's point of making sure everybody's included. I guess I would say that my information is only as good as what the Parks Department tells me is happening. So I want to make sure that that relationship is strong and the information coming to me is readily available and timely so that I have some time to do that outreach.
But we're just looking for a person to be able to be available in case there is notification.
Right, Chair. I think what Commissioner Kula said, though, is that it's not just one landowner or adjacent property owner. It's, you know, you could potentially be talking about 12 miles of
Sure.
property owners. So if it needs to be one of us, that's kind of the liaison between, that's fine. I'm willing to do it. I just, you know, I need to be notified in a timely way if Parks is going to go out and spray weeds to be able to figure out how to let them know. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioner Kula.
Oh, thank you, Chair. And to clarify, this isn't a park, right?
Correct. You know, typically, you know, in the past, we've been relying on our parks division because they also operate the work crew program that has providing a lot of the, you know, the resources to be able to go in and do some of this. But keeping in mind, over the last 12 months, the pandemic has impacted their resources. You know, so we may be approaching this as a combination that it could also be, we may need to contract with landscape companies we've had to do that in some limited means in the past as well, but working with a contractor to come in and do clearing too, depending on the type of clearing, because then there's also, you know, if we're going to approach it with some mechanical, you know, sometimes you know, a private contractor has more resources than what we have in the Parks Department. We don't use, of course, you know, a lot of people will reach our Public Works Department, but with their funding mechanism, they're, you know, this isn't work that Public Works can do because of the restrictions around their revenues. and their funding sources. So it's, even though Public Works may have a lot of this equipment, that's why we've looked to parks, because there are other maintenance, land management, property maintenance division within the county that typically has a lot of the tools and resources for doing this. So that's why we've relied on them.
Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair. And it just seems like a helpful, I think this is a helpful conversation. So hopefully it is for other people. I just wanted to clarify though that we can direct general fund dollars to Public Works to do work, right? If it's outside of the county road system right away.
We could. I would want to be very clear that, we're doing that because we've seen in the past, sometimes questions come up about the use of gas tax funds outside of county right-of-ways. And so as long as that distinction, and we are moving funds to Public Works to be able to accomplish that, to make sure that they're not using gas tax monies on this, you're correct.
I just wanted to make sure, because I'm just wondering, if it's about capacity and ability and tools, our Public Works staff are pretty amazing and they've got some pretty good tools. So but we would have to make that decision, I realize.
Thank you. Okay. So we've addressed everything that we wanted to, at least the preliminaries on these next steps on the trail. And next week we can come back with a little bit more information and be prepared to move forward on what our options are. Does anybody have anything else to add on the trail discussion, Ken?
As far as, are we looking at for next week that this would be an additional work session? I'm just thinking ahead of time, or are there specific agenda items that we should have it, where the board may want to take action on? I'm trying to think of next week's agenda, if it's as a work session, or if we need to call out some specific agenda items. I do think the budgetary, as far as the repayment, might be one of the things that would require board action. I don't know if I'm going to have something ready to put into the packet tomorrow, but I'll try my best. And so that may be an agenda item, or the other action would be is we just schedule this as a work session for next week. And then the board can always determine during that work session to make something an agenda item later in the session that you could then act and vote on as needed.
Okay, I think that makes the most sense since we still have some items to discuss. So thank you, Christian.
And just to confirm too, is the board interested in asking someone from ODOT to be available at next week's work session?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
We can do.
All right, thank you all. Appreciate the discussion. And Carrie and Friend, thank you very much for joining us on that. All right, so we'll move on to department updates. We have none. Oh,
Chair.
yes.
I just wanted to clarify on the ODOT thing. So the intention with that is to have a discussion about the grant agreement that we have with them in the letter we received. So I guess in my mind, I was thinking it's part of it, but it's also kind of separate. So I don't know, does that work in a work session? Okay, I just want to make sure, because that was my intention, is to have a discussion directly with them about the grant agreement and then go forward. So
Right, and I think if anything comes out of that, as Christian said, it could also be listed as an agenda item.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we'll move on to consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve?
I move that we approve the consent agenda as presented, and I'm also very excited about the things that are on it.
Yes, I am as well. Finally, for so many of those items, right? Thank you, Commissioner. We have a motion to approve. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. On to old business, which is item H. And I'm just wanting to get some consensus if we should take a 5-minute break at this point. Would that be agreeable? All right, so we'll go ahead and just take a 5-minute recess and then come right back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair.
Looks like everybody's back. All right, so if everybody is present and accounted for, we will come back and reconvene at the point of H, old business, which is consideration of adopting the Yamhill County Second Amendment Sanctuary Ordinance, continued from March 11th, continued from the week before that, and from the week before that. So, Christian, I know that you did redline another version, and I had looked at some of the differences between the former version and the one that we have before us. So did you want to address some of the material differences, or were there any? Commissioner Bershauer, did you want to start us off?
Sure, thank you, Chair. So we had version 4, I'm calling it version 4. It was submitted last Friday, and this is something that Christian and I worked on in response to comments that came back on the previous Thursday at the meeting. There's also a version 5, which is something that I submitted yesterday. And the reason I submitted it is because there were a couple sections in version 4 that we had changed a little bit of the language, and it just really wasn't sitting very well with me. And I think that we're trying to balance the sheriff and the DA wanting to maintain discretion, which nobody blames them for that, with the purpose of a SASO, which is to really, in our case, because we've drawn a line in the proverbial sand and said, from this point forward of March of 2021, any firearm regulations that are going to affect lawfully abiding gun owners are going to be under heightened scrutiny. So since we've drawn that line, I wanted to make sure that we applied that line to court judgments and court orders as well. So I added it to section E. I made 2 changes. Section E, 2.06, section E. I added in effect as of March of 2021, just so. Sorry, go ahead.
Bershauer, I don't have that, but Ken's also trying to raise his hand.
I just wanted to quickly, before we got too far into the discussions, to let you know that the version that Commissioner Bershauer was referring to that we got yesterday afternoon was uploaded and included in the packet. And if you go to page, it looks like it's page 21 is where that starts.
Okay, thank
you.
you.
So that way everyone can follow along.
And my sincere apologies for interrupting you.
That's okay. No, I thank Carolina for sticking that in there yesterday. So, and admit that it was last minute, but I wanted to discuss a couple of the changes. So for 2.06 section E, I added that line where if you're talking about a court order or court judgment going forward, I don't think it's really, the way I see this is the SASO is really kind of triggered at the law enforcement level. So the impact to the DA or court orders or so on and so forth are a little bit more mitigated just because the impact starts with the law enforcement level. But I did add the date into section E. Section H, I also added March of 2021, which is the date that we had discussed previously, or time frame we discussed previously. And it does retain the language around discretion of the sheriff and the district attorney. But I did add back the phrase at the end, so long as said discretion and authority is exercised consistent with the legislative directives of this ordinance. So this is what I interpret that to mean, is going forward, and we can use Senate Bill 554 as the example because we've been talking about that, but going forward, if 554 passes and becomes law, and let's just say the sheriff decides that he wants to enforce 554. First of all, it'd have to be a written directive. So there'd have to be a lot more transparency around what the sheriff is exercising in his discretion. But it also would afford the commissioners as well as the voters an opportunity to put some sideboards on that and come forward and say, wait a minute, we don't agree with you. We don't want to target lawfully abiding CHL holders. So we are going to legislate, if you will, that this county is not going to do that. So I wanted to make that clear because I've talked about the sideboards and the purpose of the SASO. And without that last line in there, I don't feel that the SASO would have any teeth, because essentially what you're saying is the DA and the sheriff can in perpetuity do whatever they want. And there's no impact of the commissioners or the voters being able to legislate what they want to see happen in the future, if that makes sense. So those were the two changes. That's what I'm calling version 5. Does anybody have any questions on that?
No, I just wanted to add, I know that in earlier iterations of this in other counties and even in other states, they had it where it was up to the sheriff's discretion. And that pretty much defeated the purpose of any Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance, in that if we were to get a Multnomah County Sheriff Mike Reese in here, it would be a whole different ballgame. So this does put those sideboards on there. And again, leaving it at the discretion of the sheriff really does defeat the purpose. So thank you for that. Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Bershauer. I apologize. I'm just looking at it now because I got, I think it's version 4, and so I actually skimmed. No, so I got version 4 when it was sent to all of us on Friday. So that was the one that I was prepared to discuss. And so in scrolling through the 413 pages, I said, great, I don't need to look at this one. So that's on me. That's my mistake that I didn't look at it in more detail. So I'm taking notes and kind of trying to switch back and forth between this and the document. And I agree that my reading of version 4 was really, I was a bit puzzled by what actually, it seems like a very narrow, future-looking set of laws that the county might be saying that they wouldn't enforce, or they would prohibit the enforcement of. And so I understand a little bit more about how that might work. And I do think honestly, it's interesting. My intellectual curiosity is piqued by the idea of saying that if voters don't like the way that the sheriff is handling things, that they have an option to legislate through the ballot box, in addition to the election of that official themselves. So I see the value of that, of what Commissioner Bershauer was saying, but I really do want to make sure that I look more closely at it. One concern that I still have about the document is that because it right now, at least version 4 was very forward looking. It was open to things like Senate Bill 554 if it were to pass. The statement around "we consider all laws null and void and of no effect" doesn't, to me, it doesn't mean anything, because then we go on to say, well, except that only these in the future are really the ones we're concerned about. So those are some of the thoughts I have initially, but again, I'm gonna, while we discuss that, I'm gonna be looking at it right now.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Bershauer?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Kula, I hear you and about that particular phrase. I think my mind goes back to what Attorney Tyler Smith said, which is typically the way you write these things is you're very vague and sort of broad at the beginning, and then you narrow it down. And so when we're narrowing it down to the exceptions, we're literally saying it does not apply to any firearm regulation in effect as of March of 2021. So I think that sort of further clarifies that. But you're right, it is forward thinking. And the whole reason is because we are, the legislature is currently discussing some pretty impactful firearm legislation and regulations. So I would agree with that.
I'd also like to add, and one of the things that I would like to see us change is, instead of it being March 2021, February of 2021, because as we know, March isn't over yet and these bills could pass at any time. And there are a number of them that are, as Commissioner Bershauer pointed out, really quite significantly impact a CHL holder's right to carry a firearm, and also in terms of home self-defense. So I'd like to see February be the 2021 instead of March, because that brings us up to the end of March and anything could happen in terms of those bills passing. So, and I think the impetus for this is, while we've had concerns about bills in the past, that there are some pretty severe restrictions that are being proposed. And since there doesn't seem to be any way to push back legislatively and to get any kind of movement there in terms of compromises, I don't know that we have any other options. So this is why so many other counties right now are actually considering the same thing. So if there are no more questions, I know Commissioner Kula, you haven't had a chance to see the whole document, but those two, that would be E and H, those are the two that have been edited in this latest iteration. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. Correct. Just E and H of 2.06, and E was, we simply added the date. And then H puts the language back in that was already discussed. So the language really isn't different. I just put the last line back in. So those are the two substantive changes. I didn't change anything else. I am amenable to making March 2021 February 2021. So I think we should change that. I believe it's only mentioned, well, I'd have to go through and check, but I think it's only mentioned in D, E, and F, or D, E, and H of section 2.06. So Christian, I don't know how this works. I feel like when this came up before, I believe it was 2019, when you guys had this discussion before, was the last time, you know, part of the criticism was that the thoughts and the concerns of the sheriff and the DA weren't really taken into account, or maybe glossed over, or whatever. But we've now discussed this for, what, 4 consecutive meetings, maybe 3, 4. So I feel like, you know, we've had some pretty rigorous due process around this, and I do feel like their concerns are heard in this current draft in version 5. So I would be, if it's possible, if we can make those changes, I would be open to doing a first reading today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kula, did you have your hand raised?
I did. I wanted to clarify that my understanding of version 5 is that it added back things that were of concern to the DA and the sheriff. That last line was actually the thing that the sheriff at least expressed concern about. So adding it back after he expressed his concerns is, you know, just it goes against what you just said.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. It does add it back, and it does push back a little bit on what they said. And the reason is because I think that version 4 gives them full discretion in perpetuity and really negates the entire purpose of a SASO. So what adding back the last sentence does, it doesn't get rid of their discretion. What it says is, if they're going to make these decisions going forward on, let's say, Senate Bill 554, if it becomes law, they have to do so in a particular way. And the particular way is to provide written directive and to let the public know and CHL holders know that they are going to enforce this law. And at that point, it allows sideboards, if the commission at the time doesn't agree with the sheriff's discretion, or if the voters don't agree with the discretion. So I'm not trying to remove discretion. I'm trying to make sure that the discretion going forward is very transparent, and our people who are CHL holders or lawfully abiding firearm owners know exactly where they stand in the county. And it also allows the public to be part of that conversation as well as the commissioners.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kula.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I guess I'm wondering, well, I'm wondering how a future Board of Commissioners and a future CHL holder in the event of a sheriff changing their discretionary policies. I'm guessing I'm confused about how they're going to know that a sheriff is doing something in opposition to an ordinance that our Board of Commissioners may have passed, especially given that it just says legislatively consistent with the legislative direction of this ordinance. Because honestly, I'm confused about the legislative direction of the ordinance.
Commissioner Bershauer? Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. That might be a question for Christian on the process, but it's my understanding that it would be an official vote. There would be something that comes forward in front of the board, and it would be an official vote. And obviously, if it comes forward from the public, you're going to know it's on the ballot. So, you know, I think if I'm the sheriff and this passes, I'm looking forward and saying, okay, you know, this applies to otherwise lawfully abiding CHL holders or gun owners. This doesn't apply to people who commit crimes or people who commit crimes with guns that are aggravating circumstances. So I'm going to be much more careful and much more clear about how I'm going to proceed, especially if Senate Bill 554 or others pass. That's really the direction that we're giving, is that there's a lot more transparency around what's happening going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kula?
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So it sounds like this is really about CHL holders, concealed handgun license holders in the future. Is that accurate?
Well, I would say that, first of all, this is not directly addressing CHL holders. This is addressing people who are law-abiding firearms owners, and not everybody who owns a firearm carries concealed. And it is legal to carry open in the state of Oregon. It's also legal to have a firearm within your home. So we're not talking CHL, we're talking those people who are law-abiding firearms owners. Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So in the future, I heard a lot of CHL, and I think it must have been with reference to Senate Bill 554, right? Okay. So then I guess the question I might have probably for Christian is what exactly does this prohibit? Or is that something you can even answer, Christian?
Thank you, Commissioner.
What does the ordinance in its current form prohibit?
That's correct.
Well, it would apply to firearms regulations passed after February of this year. So it doesn't apply to existing regulations. So at the moment, unless something passes in the interim, I'm not sure that there are any regulations that it would directly apply to.
Okay.
It would depend on what gets passed in Salem or in Washington, D.C. or at the local level. I believe that's what it's looking towards. It's intending to be forward looking. And one of the things to keep in mind in terms of whether or not or how this SASO might be enforced or enforceable in the event of that future legislation is really depends on the specific piece of legislation that gets passed, right? 554, for example. If I'm understanding it right, and I haven't looked at it in the last week or two, but assuming there haven't been changes made to it past the -10 amendments that were in place in late February, it would give local governments, districts, counties, cities, the authority to adopt an ordinance. But I believe that ordinance would say something along the lines of, we are defining our public buildings in this way for purposes of a state law. And so if someone were to violate, the violation would still be a violation of state law. not of a local ordinance, in which case I think we would still potentially could face the same preemption challenges that we've been discussing over the last several weeks. How is it that the sheriff would be carrying out his sworn duty to enforce laws if there is a limitation on his ability to exercise his discretion on whether or not to enforce that law, if it's a state law? If there is a different piece of legislation, let's say 554 changes during the course of the legislative session, and it really becomes more of a removal of the state's preemption in this area and grants cities and counties and districts some additional discretion to legislate in this area, then I think we have a different set of questions, and an ordinance like this might be more enforceable in a situation like that. So it's really going to depend, I think, on the kind of legislation that's passed. That's sort of question number one that I have. And the second is, I want to make sure that when we're looking at 2.06H, that it's clear that we're not limiting the DA or the sheriff's discretion after February of 2021. The way it reads now, it says that this doesn't apply to nor prohibit enforcement of firearms regulations in effect as of, we would change it to February of 2021, pursuant to the directives, etc. And then they retain all prosecutorial, enforcement, or administrative discretion that they would otherwise have. And I think we would probably want to add in there that they would otherwise have under federal, state, or local laws after February of 2021, so long as the said discretion is exercised consistent with the legislative directives of this ordinance. I think that makes it clearer that we're not removing their discretion post February of 2021, but the intent is to, again, as Commissioner Bershaw said, attempt to put some sideboards on the exercise of that discretion should new legislation be passed post February of 2021. Again, I do believe this is an area that the sheriff and the DA did have concerns about. I know neither of them are available today. I don't know if it would be acceptable to the board to maybe delay the first reading for another week to see if they could provide some additional comment on these latest changes next week. But I do recall that this phrase, so long as said discretion and authority is exercised consistent with the legislative directives of this ordinance, was a concern to both the DA and the sheriff in whether or not that somehow limited their ability in a way that would be contrary to state law or in violation of their constitutional oath.
Thank you for that, Kristen. I wanted to just weigh in on that. Without that sideboard, if you will, it really pretty much neuters this whole ordinance. If you don't have that, then you're basically doing what the others have done, and that is to leave it to the discretion of the sheriff. And that is explicitly what we're asking not to do. So while it allows for it allows for the discretion of the sheriff and the district attorney, it also puts those sideboards on, which is the whole purpose of this, unless I'm not.
Yeah, and therein lies the ultimate question, is whether or not constitutionally or statutorily the Board of Commissioners have the authority to put those sideboards up. And that would be the question that we would ultimately be leaving to be answered for another day. For example, if 554 were to pass and the sheriff or the DA put some, and the other thing I think we would want to make sure that if you're looking for written directives, that we add written directives back in here, because in the current draft, it was directives only, not written directives. There were directives, written administrative decisions, or written policies. If you're interested in written directives, we would need to revisit that as well. That was the concern that the DA had raised about being able to communicate direction and to his staff orally. So there's that piece as well. But yes, I think that is the question. Can the Board of Commissioners, does the Board of Commissioners have the authority to set sideboards on the discretion of the sheriff and or the DA?
Thank you, Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I think in 2.0 letter H, when it says pursuant to the directives of written administrative decisions or written policies of the county sheriff or the district attorney, I think that's pretty clear. I think it covers all of it. I don't think we need to say written directives.
Okay.
In my opinion, it's very clear that the intent of that exception is to make sure that they know going forward, whether it's 554 or it's a ban on high capacity magazines or whatever it is, they're going to have to be very clear about where their discretion is going. And in terms of the last sentence, you know, I agree with Commissioner Sterrett. I think that if you take that out, it completely makes this thing useless, and that was not the intent. The intent was to protect law-abiding firearm owners and CHL holders. So I don't want to wait. I think, you know, we've spent what, 3 or 4 meetings on this already. I think it's worth doing a first reading today, so long as we can change that date to February of 2020.
Okay, so at this point, I'll entertain a motion. Commissioner Kula.
Yeah, I had a couple more things that I wanted to ask about. I mean, it sounds like there's a desire to get this done now, and I hear that desire. I also see adding back in when the sheriff and the DA aren't available for comment, things that they've asked to not have in there. I understand that the Board of Commissioners has, they can do what they want around that, but this is not, I don't see that as respecting their comments and their authority as elected officials. But what I would love to know is who's going to enforce this? And that might be a question for Christian.
Thank you, Commissioner. Christian?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's one that we've discussed on a couple of occasions, and maybe well, that's probably not a good example, but let's say 554 passed in its current form, and the sheriff put out a written directive similar to what he said in the past about 941. He's not going to be committing significant resources. He's not going to be putting together a team of deputies to launch investigations into whether or not there are violations of 941 in terms of the transfer of firearms. But if in the course of an investigation or an arrest of bad guys, as he's put it, it came to their attention that there had been a violation of 941, he would feel compelled under his sworn duty to enforce 941. I don't know how he would approach 554, but I imagine his thought process might be similar. That's where I think it would be good to be able to hear from him. But that it isn't something he's going to aggressively pursue, set up an investigative staff to go out and try to enforce. But if it came to them, based on previous conversations we've had, I understand that he would feel it is his duty to enforce that state law. And to the extent this ordinance attempts to limit his ability to exercise that discretion, therein lies the conflict. So he decides he still retains the discretion as the elected official to enforce those laws. He decides to do that. And then this gets to your question of enforcement. One of his deputies goes out and cites for a violation of 554, or staff uses county resources to further a citation or the housing of a inmate or the processing of an adult in custody, on their way to a hearing. And who would then enforce against them if it was deemed that those activities were a violation of this ordinance? Would it be a fellow deputy from the sheriff's office that would be citing their coworker for violating the county ordinance? Would it be our code enforcement officer, which this is not an area in which they have exercised any citation authority before. And so then you have one arm of county government citing another arm of county government to pay a fine to the county for a violation of its own ordinance. So it does get complicated in that sense. And I suspect the DA might face some similar concerns if he decides to prosecute a violation of 554, because he feels that it's his sworn duty to do so, and then is cited by a representative of the sheriff's office or another county representative for violating the county ordinance.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. So who enforces ordinances now? We have several ordinances. How are they enforced?
Yeah, Ken, we looked at that the other day. Do you have that info?
I do. So currently there's ordinance 755. I believe this is the most current. There may be something, I'm just looking through the list, which was board order 05-162 that established authority for issuing, enforcement of county ordinances and sorry, I'm reading at the same time and looking at it. And so under that, where you have solid waste management, you have code violations, building codes, and it's called out specifically, laws enforceable under this ordinance. Like I was saying, solid waste, land division, zoning ordinance, building, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, just some examples. And so the following individuals under this ordinance, it's the planning director or designee. So code enforcement would fall under that because their code enforcement officer is an employee of the planning department. So it's a designee under. And number two is Yamhill County Sheriff or any deputy of the sheriff's office designated as an enforcement officer under ORS 153.005.
Okay, so it sounds like it might be different for different types of ordinances.
Well, and that also includes parks ordinance, the noise ordinance. There are several other ordinances that are in place that are local ordinances that, the sheriff's office and code enforcement have the ability to issue citations under this. And Todd joined, so.
We currently enforce through the citation ordinance all of those listed ordinances, and we also, if we can't get the results we want through that, we file for an injunction in circuit court.
Okay. Well, it might be odd. I don't know. Maybe that's something that we can look at in terms of who enforces this particular one, or if it can even be changed. But I want to go back to something that Christian said about the DA deciding to pursue a charge on, let's say 554 goes through as presented. How would that not pass through the sheriff's law enforcement level? How does that not go and percolate up from the sheriff's department?
I think it more than likely would. They would both likely be involved. I was thinking more in terms of exercising prosecutorial discretion.
And I wanted this might be a good analogy. Right now, our district attorney is looking into an issue that the Multnomah County DA has pretty much that whole situation where you've probably heard that the DA in Multnomah County has made some decisions not to prosecute certain crimes related to rioting and violence during the riots in Portland. And so there are those who are concerned about the fact that he has said unilaterally, I will not prosecute these types of crimes. But then there are others who are saying that he is unfairly prosecuting some people on perhaps the other side of the protest aisle, if you will. So our DA is right now investigating that because it needed to be sent out of Multnomah County. So I think if you were to take the district attorney in Multnomah County, Mike Schmidt, I believe his name is, and he's made a decision not to prosecute rioters, let's just say. And the Board of Commissioners in Multnomah County, if they had said, you don't make this decision, these are crimes and they need to be prosecuted. And he has made a decision not to do that. So I think this is a sort of an analogy to that, is that the Board of Commissioners here is saying, you've got a district attorney who's made a decision not to do something, and those are the side boards that the Board of Commissioners is saying, we want those crimes to be prosecuted. So that's just something that came to mind because it's current. Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, is that me? Okay. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to kind of return that suggestion to us in that, again, they would be, the Board of Commissioners in Multnomah County would be telling the DA how to do his job as a duly elected official in their county, elected by voters. And so, again, that has been a concern, a through line for me, is that I don't think that we should be telling them what to do. So what I'm going to then bring us back to is that there's been talk of a future, there might be disagreements between voters and boards of commissioners and a future DA or a future sheriff, and that they can tell the future sheriff and the future board of commissioner or future DA what they want them to enforce and not enforce. And so I guess what I'm puzzled by the idea that we would decide now what a future board of commissioners and future voters are going to be telling their future sheriff and future DA. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? Sorry, I love that phrase, and Commissioner Sterrett loves good phrases. So.
Okay, I'm down with it, Commissioner. I'm down with it. Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my response to that is that I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and the Second Amendment is part of that. So I'm going to do what I can to protect the lawfully abiding Second Amendment folks in our county.
In the future, though, right?
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, though, that this ordinance prohibits the use of resources, funds, etc., when, as the directives are laid out, a particular law enforcement officer would try to cite someone or send someone through the process based on, a violation of the ordinance. So in some ways, it's kind of self-policing, because, I mean, if I'm the sheriff, I'm going to make sure my deputies know, hey, the SASO passed, here's what it says. We're operating as normal currently, but if something like 554 comes down, I'm going to have to make a decision as to, am I going to exercise discretion and enforce it, or am I not? And I have to make that clear, and we need to be clear so that the citizens in our county are aware of what's going on. And so I don't see how there's a pretty strong self-policing element to this, but Commissioner Kula is right. It does allow county commissioners to come in and have a voice in that discussion, as well as the voters. So it is a significant change, and that's the purpose of a SASO, and that's why 16 other counties have them, because they were concerned enough about further restrictions on firearms and firearm regulations.
Christian, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, to that last point, a number of counties have this, but as Mr. Smith himself has admitted, I don't believe any of them have enforced. And we're spending a fair amount of time today talking about enforcement, because I think it's important to understand how enforcement might be done. I wanted to pose a hypothetical. So assume something like 554 passes and the sheriff or the DA puts in writing, I reserve the right to exercise my discretion as to whether or not or when I might enforce under this law. Is that a violation of the ordinance?
Commissioner Burschauer, because to me, the first thing that pops into my mind is that last phrase, which is consistent with the legislative directive, which is what gives this, makes it worth the paper that it's on. Otherwise, there's really no point. And so I know that the other counties have passed these. Some of them have been in effect for a good number of years. We've never seen any of them in any way challenged. And so at this point, I'm going to call for the question and ask for a motion. We've had a number of weeks of discussion. We've looked at this up one side and down the other. We've considered it. We know that the ramifications of having to do something like this, unfortunately, are because at the end of the day, we're backed into a corner in terms of protecting our Second Amendment rights. So I'm going to call for the question and ask for a motion.
Chair, I make a motion. Well, and I don't know which motion I'm making, whether it's for the first reading or maybe Christian can clarify.
Yeah, if you're ready, you could call for the first reading. Before we did that, I would want to also point out there are a couple of other housekeeping corrections that I noticed, which, given the fact that we're making revisions during the meeting, I think in the interests of transparency, and so everyone understands exactly what it is that the board is conducting a first reading on, that we may have no choice but to read the ordinance in its entirety, just to make sure that everyone's clear on what it is that's being considered.
So
toward that end, under section 1.01A, there is a reference to section 4, which is actually section 2. And I would note that when I did the reading. Under section 2.01, extraterritorial acts for which enforcement is prohibited by section 3 should actually be section 1. Under 2.06, exceptions to section 3 should actually be exceptions to section 1. And then we would be modifying March of 2021 to say February of 2021. And if you don't mind, I would sort of read the entirety of 2.06H to make sure that as I read it later, it reflected what the board intended. All right, so that would say this ordinance does not apply to nor prohibit enforcement of firearms regulations in effect as of February 2021, pursuant to the directives of written administrative decisions or written policies of the county sheriff or the district attorney, and the sheriff and district attorney retain all prosecutorial, enforcement, or administrative discretion and authority that the sheriff or district attorney would otherwise have under federal, state, or local laws after February 2021, so long as said discretion and authority is exercised consistent with the legislative directives of this ordinance.
That's correct. That's what I've written down.
Right, okay.
So, Chair, I guess I'm making a motion to have the first reading of the matter of declaring a Second Amendment sanctuary in Yamhill County based upon version 5 that was submitted, plus the revisions that we've made during this meeting.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have a motion on the table. Any further discussion? Commissioner Kula.
I would just reiterate my my position kind of all along, and I just want to put that back out there, that I think it's important for our sheriff and our DA to have discretion as elected officials duly elected by the voters in Yamhill County. And then I think we can support them in that. And I don't think that this does that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to respond briefly to Christian's point about could the sheriff, if 554 passes, could the sheriff have a written directive that says, I'm going to use my discretion on a case-by-case basis when it comes to 554? Yes, he could under this ordinance. However, if the voters did not agree with that, or if the commissioners at the time did not agree with that, and we wanted explicitly stated that 554, when it comes into contact with anyone on county property or for the use of county resources, that we are explicitly stating it will not be enforced. So it does give him that option. We are not removing the sheriff's discretion. We're simply putting some sideboards on it and saying we need a lot more transparency going forward about how certain laws are going to be enforced, and also bringing to the table the voters and the commissioners.
And then there would need to be some sort of later action of the board or the voters to explicitly make clear that their intent would be that those laws not be enforced.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to
That's how I
add-
read it too.
I'm sorry, Christian, go ahead.
No, that's fine. That's sort of how I read it as well.
Okay.
And I think that helps. But yeah, again, we've talked a number of times now about the questions that might still raise.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think that there are always going to be questions in anything that the board does, as witnessed by our first discussion item today. We spent a decade talking about one particular project, and we weren't able to address all of the inevitabilities. One of the things I wanted to add is that the commissioners have received probably conservatively about 1,200 emails in favor of supporting the county's Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance. One of them was from a Yamhill County mayor. A number of them were from retired law enforcement. Others were from veterans. One was from an elderly woman. Another was from a domestic violence survivor. And there were a number of people who said, I don't live in your county, but this gives me hope that my county might follow suit. And it also gives me a measure of affinity for your county as a result of this. So I just wanted to say that this is for all of the law-abiding people who have jumped through every hoop that we continue to add, and that requires background checks, fingerprinting, firearms training, paying a fee every couple of years to maintain the right to carry a firearm as a law-abiding citizen. So this is for all those people who feel that they're not being heard in Salem, they're not being heard in Washington, D.C., and that the Second Amendment still does mean what it says, that it shall not be infringed. And that is why I am really looking forward to being able to pass this in Yamhill County. So we have a motion. Any further discussion? We'll go ahead and ask for the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Okay, let the record show that Commissioner Starrett and Bershauer voted in favor of passing a Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance. Commissioner Kula voted in opposition. So then at this point, we'll have a first reading. Commissioner Bershauer?
Oh,
Is that right, Christian?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Commissioner Bershauer, do you want to go ahead with the first reading?
oh, okay. I thought it had to be Christian, but I can read it. Okay. In the Board of Commissioners of the State of Oregon for the County of Yamhill, sitting for the transaction of county business in the matter of declaring a Second Amendment sanctuary in Yamhill County, the Board of Commissioners of Yamhill County, Oregon, also known as the board, sat for the transaction of county business in combined informal formal session on March 18th.
Well, I believe that ultimately would be April 1st, because that would be 2 weeks from today. We're having a first reading, so that would, there needs to be at least 13 days in between the readings. So the date of adoption would likely be, if it were acted on 2 weeks from today, would be April 1st.
So in combined informal formal session on April 1st of 2021 at 10 a.m. in a virtual meeting via Zoom, Commissioners Mary Starrett, Lindsay Burschauer, and Casey Kula being present, the duly elected Board of County Commissioners of Yamhill County, Oregon find and declare, whereas acting through the United States Constitution, the people created government to be their agent in the exercise of a few defined powers while reserving the citizens' right to decide on matters which concern their lives, liberties, and properties in the ordinary course of affairs. Whereas the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America states, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, unquote. Whereas the rights of the people to keep and bear arms are further protected from infringement by the state and local governments under the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America, as well as Article 1 of the Constitution of the Great State of Oregon. Whereas Article 1, Section 27 of the Constitution of the Great State of Oregon states, quote, the people shall have the right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, but the military shall be kept in strict subordination to the civil power, unquote. Whereas Article 1, Section 33 of the Constitution of the Great State of Oregon states, quote, the enumeration of rights and privileges shall not be construed to impair or deny others retained by the people, unquote. Whereas the Supreme Court of the United States of America in District of Columbia versus Heller upheld the individual rights to bear arms as protected by the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. Justice Scalia's opinion stated that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. Whereas Justice Thomas M. Cooley in the People versus Hurlbut, 24 Michigan 44, page 108, 1871, surmises, the state may mold local institutions according to its views of policy or expediency, but local government is matter of absolute right and the state cannot take it away, unquote. Whereas the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America, Section 1, it states, quote, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, unquote. Whereas there is a right to be free from the commandeering hand of government that has been most notably recognized by the United States Supreme Court in Prince versus United States. The court held, quote, the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program, unquote. Whereas it should be self-evident from the compounding evidence that the right to keep and bear arms is the fundamental individual right that shall not be infringed, and all local, state, and federal acts, laws, orders, rules, or regulations regarding firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition are a violation of the Second Amendment. Whereas Yamhill County asserts its legal authority to refuse to cooperate with state and federal firearm laws that violate those rights and to proclaim a Second Amendment sanctuary for law-abiding citizens and their cities and counties. Whereas, therefore, through the enactment of this ordinance, Yamhill County, Oregon is hereby a Second Amendment sanctuary county. Now, therefore, and make sure you stop me if I miss something. The Yamhill County Board of Commissioners ordains as follows. Section 1, Prohibition 1.01. No agent, employee, or official of Yamhill County, a political subdivision of the state of Oregon, while acting in their official capacity shall, A, knowingly and willingly participate in any way in the enforcement of any extraterritorial act as defined in Section 2. Or B, utilize any county assets, county funds, or funds allocated by any entity to the county in whole or in part to engage in any activity that violates this ordinance by aiding in the enforcement or investigation of extraterritorial acts relating to personal firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition. Section 2, penalties. 2.01. All local, state, and federal acts, laws, rules, or regulations originating from jurisdictions outside of Yamhill County, which restrict or affect an individual person's general right to keep and bear arms, including firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition, are, for all purposes under this ordinance, defined as extraterritorial acts. Such extraterritorial acts are specifically rejected by this county and shall not be enforced by Yamhill County agents, employees, or officers, and shall be treated as if they are null, void, and of no effect in Yamhill County, Oregon. Extraterritorial acts for which enforcement is prohibited by Section 1 include A, any tax, levy, fee, or stamp imposed on firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition not common to all other goods and services on the purchase or ownership of those items by citizens, and B, any registering or tracking of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition, and C, any registering or tracking of the owners of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition, and D, any registration and background check requirements on firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition for citizens, and E, any extraterritorial act forbidding the possession, ownership, or use or transfer of any type of firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition by citizens of the legal age of 18 and over, and F, any extraterritorial act ordering the confiscation of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition from citizens, and G, any prohibitions, regulations, and/or use restrictions related to ownership of non-fully automatic firearms, including but not limited to semi-automatic firearms, including semi-automatic firearms that have the appearance or features similar to fully automatic firearms and/or military, quote, assault style, unquote, firearms by citizens. And H, any prohibition, regulations, and/or use restrictions limiting hand grips, stocks, flash suppressors, bayonet mounts, magazine capacity, clip capacity, internal capacity, or types of ammunition available for sale, possession, or use by citizens. And I, any restrictions prohibiting the possession of open carry or concealed carry or the transport of lawfully acquired firearms or ammunition by adult citizens or minors supervised by adults. Section 2.02. Any agent, employee, or official of Yamhill County, Oregon, accused to be in violation of this ordinance may be made a defendant in a civil proceeding pursuant to ORS 203.065. Section 2.03. Fines recovered under ORS 203.030 to 203.075 shall be paid to the clerk of the court in which recovery is had. After first deducting court costs in the proceedings, the clerk shall pay the remainder to the treasurer of the county for the general fund of the county pursuant to ORS 203.065. Section 2.04. A violation of this ordinance is a Class A violation per ORS 203.065 with a maximum fine of $2,000 for an individual and $4,000 for a corporation per ORS 153.018. Section 2.05. Any peace officer, as defined by ORS 161.015, may enforce this ordinance adopted under ORS 203.035. Section 2.06. Exceptions to Section 1. Letter A. The protections provided in Yamhill County by Section 1.01 of this ordinance do not apply to persons who have been convicted of felony crimes. B. This ordinance is not intended to prohibit or affect in any way the prosecution of any crime for which the use of or possession of a firearm is an aggravating factor or enhancement to an otherwise independent crime. C. This ordinance does not permit or otherwise allow the possession of firearms in state or federal buildings or courthouses. D. This ordinance does not prohibit Yamhill County, its employees, officials, and agents from enforcing local, federal, or state firearms acts, laws, rules, or regulations in effect as of February 2021. Letter E, actions in compliance with a court judgment or court order based upon any extraterritorial act in effect as of February 2021 are exempt from this ordinance. Letter F, this ordinance does not prohibit Yamhill County from enacting any other legislation to govern its own residents and exclusively and only applies to county officials, employees, and agents whose role and duties are primarily, if not wholly, a county concern. G, this ordinance does not apply to nor prohibit the enforcement of local firearms regulations which have been enacted by the voters of Yamhill County. Letter H, this ordinance does not apply to nor prohibit enforcement of firearms regulations in effect as of February 2021 pursuant to the directives of written administrative decisions or written policies of the county sheriff or the district attorney, and the sheriff and district attorney retain all prosecutorial, enforcement, or administrative discretion and authority that the sheriff or district attorney would otherwise have under federal, state, or local laws after February of 2021, so long as said discretion and authority is exercised consistent with the legislative directives of this ordinance. Section 3, private cause of action. 3.01. Any official, agent, or employee of Yamhill County who knowingly violate this ordinance or an extraterritorial act pertaining to this ordinance shall be liable to the injured party in an action at law, suit in equity, or other proper proceeding for redress. Section 3.02. In such actions, the court shall award the prevailing party, other than the government of Yamhill County, Oregon, or any political subdivision of the county, reasonable attorney fees and costs. 3.03. Neither sovereign nor governmental immunity shall be an affirmative defense of agent, employee, or official of Yamhill County in cases pursuant to Section 2 or 3 of this ordinance. Should that be 1 or 2? I feel like that might be. I think that should read 1 or 2. You're muted.
Sorry. No, I think it's correct because 2 refers to the penalties and 3 refers to the private cause of action.
Oh, okay.
But I would say one thing, and this is my mistake. Under 3.01, Commissioner Bershauer, I think you and I had discussed, and this might have been reflected or should have been reflected in the prior draft, the phrase "or an extraterritorial act pertaining to this ordinance." We had talked about that and agreed that I thought we had agreed that that should come out.
Yes, we did, because it's repetitive.
Yeah.
Can I
So
reread?
that would be one, and I can make that correction in the final draft. That would be reflected in the second reading.
Okay, so I don't need to reread it.
I don't think so.
Let's see, Section 4, severability. The provisions of this ordinance are hereby declared to be severable, and if any provision of this ordinance or the application of such provision to any person or circumstance is declared invalid for any reason, such declaration shall not affect the validity of the remaining portions of this ordinance. Section 5, effective date. The effective date of this ordinance, the Second Amendment Sanctuary Ordinance, or SASO, shall be effective.
Right, and then I had a comment. So
Yeah.
it will be effective immediately if it's unanimous and declared to be an emergency. Otherwise, if it's non-unanimous, it would take effect 90 days after the date of adoption. So
Okay, so maybe I just say, shall be effective 90 days after adoption, and then at the second reading, we can fill in that particular date.
yeah, I suspect, given Commissioner Kula's vote against the first reading, that at this point anyway, with the way in which the ordinance is drafted, he is inclined to vote in opposition to the adoption of the ordinance. So I think it would be safe to reflect that in the second reading. And then if changes are made and ultimately the board can get to a place where it is unanimous, then we can talk about what else would need to happen in order for it to be adopted as an emergency and go into effect immediately.
Okay. Well, that's the entirety of the ordinance. Does that satisfy the requirements for the first reading?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments, Commissioner.
So at this
Oh.
point, two weeks from today would be the soonest that the ordinance could come back for the second reading and consideration for adoption by the board.
Thank you, Christian.
Mhm.
So we'll move on to our other business, which is item I, which is consideration of the appointment of 2 citizen positions to the Solid Waste Advisory Committee, SWAC, each for a 3-year term to expire March 18th, 2024. Ken, do you want to give us the landscape on this one?
Oh, yes. This is Ken, me, not Ken Friday. I was looking to see, did Ken Friday join us? Because this is something.
He is here if you want to pull him in, but I don't think he probably needs to.
I don't believe so. So what was provided in the memo, I believe Ashley had pulled together the memo, is there's 2 positions, 2 vacant positions, and the board was presented with sorry, I'm scrolling to this and make sure I get this correct. My apologies. I wasn't expecting this to come to me. So
No, that's okay. I can go ahead and read the applicants, and then we can go ahead if there are any questions. Commissioner Bershauer?
I found it.
Chair, can I actually request like a 2-minute break?
Yes. Okay,
would
we'll
that be
take a
okay?
2-minute
Okay,
break.
2 minutes. Okay.
2 minutes. Thank
Sounds
you.
good.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Okay, so we're back and we're discussing the appointment of 2 citizen positions to the Solid Waste Advisory Committee. And we've had a chance to look at the applicants. And does anybody have discussion or suggestions on filling those vacancies?
Sorry, Chair, I'm trying to open it.
Chair, sorry, Commissioner Kula, were you gonna say something?
I just didn't want to let Chair think I was just flaking out on her, that I was switching back and forth. But go ahead, Commissioner.
I would
Bershauer.
never think that, Commissioner. Absolutely never would ever cross my mind. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I reviewed the applications. I think they all have great qualifications. I would make a motion that we consider appointing Marcia, I think it's Mikesh, and Jerry Hunter to fill the 2 citizen positions to the Solid Waste Advisory Committee.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Kula, comments?
No, I think that's perfectly appropriate. We get some geographic distribution around the county, folks who've been involved for a long time in different aspects of solid waste and recycling. I think it's a perfectly appropriate combination. But again, these are all very well qualified applicants.
And I think this really does answer some of the concerns that we're not addressing. We've got somebody who's affiliated with Stop the Dump and another affiliation with Zero Waste Management. So it gives sort of a broad perspective on SWAC, which I think is really important. So I think that's appropriate. And we have a motion to approve Marcia Mikesh and Jerry Hunter. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. Congratulations, and we appreciate their willingness to serve in this volunteer capacity, and also to everybody who submitted an application.
And Chair, if I might, I feel like we should also thank Christian for a lot of time that went into this, the membership ordinance that got us to this place, and Ashley Watkins.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Ashley. This has been one of those discussion items that we've had ongoing for several years. So thank you for that. And thank you for those who have held our feet to the fire. On to item I2, which is consideration of extending the COVID-19 telecommuting policy per Board Order 20-104. Ken?
Yes, the current policy was extended to March 31st. And I want to make sure that there's sufficient time for, consideration with that, with that deadline coming up. And, I didn't have anything written up or included in the packet, knowing that last time I was asking or requesting for a June 1st, but, I think I'm going to leave it up to the discretion of the board for an extension. I will say again, like I've said in previous times, even though we are seeing that we're gradually moving down in the COVID restrictions, we do have a large number of OSHA required rules that we're trying to comply with. We have facility limitations. We have a lot of circumstances that frontline supervisors and managers and staff are having to navigate within the buildings and making these determinations. And what this telecommuting policy does is it provides a framework, and it's essentially a tool in the toolbox for the supervisor and managers to have available to them on figuring out how we can continue to deliver services while we're still in the process of navigating and trying to provide services, at the same time with a pandemic and with all these rules and restrictions that are in place. We're having a lot of discussions with department heads and at the office level of, with the changing and restrictions, being able to start opening things back up where buildings have been closed or no in-person interaction. We're getting offices into a position and making sure that the safety of our staff and the public that are coming in and seeking services is still a major priority. But there still is a need and a desire to have this policy continue in place so it can just further accommodate it. We can phase back into what open looks like again in the near future. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ken. And I'm looking at these proposed OSHA temporary rules that could become permanent. They're pretty restrictive. And I have concerns going forward, not only for the county, but for other business owners. If you look at some of those restrictions, make it really difficult to conduct business. So I hope that we're able to fully open and just get back into being in business. So I would entertain a motion for item I2.
I move that we approve item I2.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. We have a motion to approve. Any further discussion?
So just Ken has a further discussion.
Ken?
I need to know how long.
All right.
It's consideration of extending, but I need to know date certain, 30 days, 60 days. I just wanted to ask for that.
Commissioner Bershauer, comment? Did you have your hand up?
Chair, I guess I can let Commissioner Kula finish his motion and then we can I have a discussion point.
Okay, we had a motion. Oh, we want to go to the date. So what is your recommendation? What would make life easier for you and department heads, Ken?
I would like to propose June 1st.
Okay. So do you want to amend your motion?
I would move that we approve item I3
to
extending the telecommuting policy through June 1st.
Okay, thank you for that motion. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. So when we passed an extension last time to March 31st, the direction to county staff and department heads was, hey, you have until March 31st. So how much progress has been made? Because to June 1st is considerable time. And our message when we said that was, we need to gear up to getting back to work because that's what everyone else is doing.
And I guess my answer would be, at the time that the teleworking, I believe we were still in the extreme risk category. We've since moved to the moderate, which was effective last Friday. We moved to high, and now we've moved to the moderate since last Friday, which has a different layer of restrictions, but there are still restrictions in place that we have to adhere to, and with the OSHA rules. All the departments, we've been working diligently in looking at areas that, because we're expanding in-person service delivery, but recognizing that we have not stopped delivering services during this time. In fact, we have been, throughout the pandemic for the last 12 months, the county has been delivering services. It's just the method in delivering the services have been somewhat modified or changed due to the restrictions that have come down. And so we're continuing to make those modifications, but it's on a case by case, office by office update. And if there's more specific information that the board is looking for about what those individual actions that have taken place, I can get that information and provide it if there's specific details.
And Chair, if I might,
Yes.
I believe that what we did on a previous iteration is that we simply approved this. I know that you expressed your own views on the matter, but I don't think we directed staff in any way beyond extending it through the end of this month.
Right, and I think we should point out that we're sort of at the mercy of not only the OSHA regulations, which are temporary and perhaps going to be permanent, but also when there are those restrictions per each risk level, that we don't really get to make those calls. If it were up to us, let's say we would unilaterally say everything's open, but we have to abide by those at this point in time. So we don't get a lot of leeway on these, to be fair.
Chair, if I might, what we discussed last time was that that's true, but there's other counties who have been open for business and never closed. Marion County, Polk County. Marion County is a lot larger than we are. So I think what I was hoping for when we extended it last time is that there would be a significant gear up for, okay, if we're going back to in person, everybody's going back to work, what does that look like? And if we are restricted physically because we're working closer than 6 feet or whatever, then the plan needs to be in place for either keeping some people telecommuting or rotating people through. But I don't want to get into a position where we say June 1st and then everybody's just sort of waiting to see what happens with the risk levels, and then we come to June 1st and it's like, well, we don't really know what to do. I was very clear last time that we need to get back to work. Things are opening back up. Restaurants are opening back up. The governor issued a directive to open schools again. This needs to be our focus, getting people back to work. So that's my concern.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't think people are not working. I think what this does is it gives administrator and department heads the option and the latitude to acknowledge that we have these restrictions. I mean, if you look at some of the buildings that we have where people can't physically be 6 feet apart, I'm all for opening everything up. But with the restrictions that we have, I think this is, my understanding is that the administrator and the department heads have been asked to pretty much, administrator has asked department heads to pretty much, let's get back to work to the degree that we can. This just gives you the option. Is that right, Ken?
That is correct, because, the other thing that I would just emphasize is we have a lot of our county services and operations and offices have not closed at all because we cannot, close 100%. And so we have been operating. And again, I am, rely on and empower on the department heads and the frontline managers with their service delivery and making those operational decisions on how we can accommodate telework, how we can overcome physical limitations with the facilities. We're looking at the exposure, we're looking at the guidelines, we're looking at OSHA. This is something that we've been navigating and dealing with the challenges for quite some time. And we are looking at, for those areas and for those positions that we could not accommodate telework has not been, it hasn't been an option, and we've had to explore other means. And so we have been navigating that. We're constantly having discussions. I still meet with department heads on a weekly basis. We're constantly going through the OSHA guidelines. We're constantly having these discussions. We're looking at the operational considerations, and we're trying to deliver as many services as we can, but also keeping in mind that we have all these other restrictions that we're trying to maintain compliance for. So we haven't been closed, and the other part is each county has to make certain decisions on their closures, and that's an independent discussion. And I just wanted to say that, I am aware of Polk County and Marion County have had closures. They have closed during time periods. I think the other jurisdictions are navigating like we have on doing Board of Commissioner sessions in a virtual format. We're still not at a place where we could go back into room 32 and, as an example, and comply with the current restrictions and guidelines that are in place because of the square footage requirements for how many people you have there, the masking requirements, and all of those items that are still in place. That's just another element that I just wanted to highlight that. And again, this policy is not never has been a close your office or reopen your office policy. This policy allows a framework for us to review, consider, and have as the option to be able to accommodate teleworking to where it's practical or operationally feasible. And that's really what this policy is in place for. And I do know that departments are actively working on how we can transition in for those services that may have been struggling in a virtual format that we need to restore in person. And that's being considered on that case by case on an office by office operational decision. And so we are actively working that direction, and doors are opening, in-person services are being delivered. And we just want to make sure that we're in compliance with OSHA, OHA, and the current guidelines.
Thank you. Any
Sorry,
further
that was
questions?
a lot.
Now, I lost track. Did we take a vote?
We didn't. There's a motion on the floor.
Okay, so we have a motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. Is that everybody unanimous? Okay, thank you. On to item I3, which is discussion of the Budget Committee citizen vacancy. And commissioners, you've received applications from a number of people who have applied for this vacancy. And have you had a chance to look at them? And are there any recommendations? Commissioner
Chair, I'm just very glad to see these three individuals here. And I think that all of them would be great for this position. The only one that I know at all is Isaac Kearns. So the others, I don't know anything beyond what we have in front of us.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was very impressed with the applications, and the one that kind of stuck out to me was Doreen App, just based on her very extensive experience in the financial and banking world. I think that would be an asset to the County Budget Committee. I also know Isaac Kearns as well, just through family friends. But at this point, I think I would make a motion to appoint Doreen App to fill out the rest of the term that of the position I previously held.
All right, we have a motion to appoint Doreen App to the Budget Committee. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. And we thank everybody who applied and appreciate the fact that they're willing to serve. On to
Chair.
Yes.
Oh yeah. So I think this is the last of item I, or section I. That was the last. Is that correct? I'm trying to flip back and forth.
Correct.
And the one thing that came up in conversation today is that tomorrow is the deadline for sending in a letter of intent, and that's literally just an email from Cynthia Thompson to, I think it's the Federal Highway Administration, expressing interest in applying for the no emission, low emission vehicle program. And I wanted to put that out there. I realize it's short notice, but it really is just the first like gatekeeping step in applying for the grants for low emission vehicles for transit. Cynthia's kind of sketch of an idea is 2 all-electric buses with the charging station for them as a pilot project to see how they work for within city transit routes, which will be much quieter and much less stinky. That is the sum total of the information. You would receive the grant application before it's submitted, but this is a required step of the Board of Commissioners before she does that. And so I apologize that it's short notice, but I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner. Has the Transit Advisory Committee been involved in this discussion?
That I apologize. I do not know. I do know that the Parkway Committee sent in a unanimous measure of support for this application. Ken, do you know if the Parkway Committee has been discussed? If the Transit Advisory Committee has discussed?
No, and I reached out to Cynthia just before the start of session and to clarify, because I think the letter of intent to apply needs to be submitted to ODOT for tomorrow, and then the application is due on March 29th. I do know that there is in the transportation plan some goals or statements, the transit plan, not the transportation plan. The transit plan, there's some statements about looking at, I believe it's more of a general goal around the alternative, fuels for the fleet. And I know that Cynthia has been, sorry for kicking the tires or trying to, having the thought process about what a pilot project or may look like. I don't believe that this has as a specific item, because I'm not sure when the last, the Transit Advisory Committee last met, if this was a specific agenda item as far as a pilot project or an additional project to the current projects that Cynthia already has underway. So that was a really long answer to say, I don't know if that conversation, but I don't believe so.
Okay, a question. So the application is due on March 29th?
Yes, it appears it's one of those, and I've seen these with other grants, that you have to first submit a letter of intent to apply, and then you get extended an invitation to proceed a lot of times, or I haven't seen the details of this mechanic, but you submit the letter of intent, and then at a later date, then your full application would be due.
So as far as Commissioner Kula, have you talked to Cynthia about this?
Yes, this is me bringing it forward because she said, oh, well, you and Ken can just approve this. I'm like, Ken and I were like, oh, we think this needs to go to the full board. So, but Christian has a
Yes,
comment.
he does.
This has been an ongoing conversation between Michelle Gigari, who's our lobbyist on the bypass, and Cynthia and me and Ken.
Okay, Christian, thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, I apologize for adding to this anymore, but the board has gotten into the practice of having requests to apply for grants come before the board for the last 5 to 7 years. And I think the intent behind that is you wanted to understand what folks were applying for before they came to you with a grant agreement that might obligate the county to fund a position for a year or 2 or 3 without really knowing how that position might be funded once the terms of the grant end. I'm not aware of any specific requirement that grant applications have to come to the board for consideration first. We have gotten into the practice of doing that. I'm also not aware of a situation where letters of intent to apply need to come before the board. I'm not suggesting that you change your practice at all. I'm just putting it out there that is the practice that this board has gotten into. But this is the first time I think I've heard of a letter of intent to apply coming to the board for a decision, but I may be wrong about that. You're certainly free to discuss it, consider it, and act on it. I'm just letting you know my bit of institutional memory around this.
Ken, thank you, Christian.
I would just say, my recommendation is I think this is a good practice to have in place. It's been in place for quite some time. It gives the board a heads up to weigh in on applications that are being submitted and proposed. And then it also helps because keeping in mind that a lot of the, you may see certain funding sources, like this one, probably Transit's the only one that's going to apply for it. But then it also, if there's other programs or grant resources out there that may be multiple departments may have projects that may apply, is where we don't end up in a situation to where we have 2 departments competing against one another for this grant, which, it just further clarifies and prioritizes projects and certain funding sources to make sure that we have strong applications being submitted on behalf of the county instead of potentially diluting where we have multiple competing departments for the same pot of funds, you know. So that's part of it. It's not unusual. I think a lot of times when we run into short timelines when it comes to submitting letters, a notice of intent to apply, sometimes we'll do that, but we'll still bring it back for ratification by the board when we run into timeline considerations. So that being said, in response to that, departments are used to this process, and I think there's some value in continuing moving forward on having the board weigh in and review grant applications as, you know, at this time.
Okay, I have a question. So if we send in a letter of intent or interest,
Mm-hmm.
what does that consign Cynthia to do? And is this in her bandwidth? And is this, I have another question, is this in terms of timing, you know, knowing that we have a number of we have a list of things we're trying to get done, and not the least of which is a facility. I always think cart before the horse type of thing. I'm wondering if this is one of those ready, fire, aim things where it might be good, but we don't have to grasp at it because we're not ready for it. And I think we've done that in the past, and we've paid the price. So I'm just a little concerned that, number one, Cynthia doesn't have the bandwidth, that it's a little premature, and that how much does this letter mean we're committed to, I guess.
So I think I could probably answer that.
Okay.
What was it was the second one that became the first one, and then probably can answer the other one, which is that Cynthia has expressed that she is ready to apply for this, but then again, that letter of intent is a short turnaround time. And Ken very graciously said, well, she can submit it and then we can bring it back to the Board of Commissioners for ratification. But I think it's important for you to know straight out of the gate that this is a proposal. The second question, I think, is probably for Ken.
Thank you, Commissioner.
You know, as far as bandwidth, I only had a brief conversation with Cynthia, you know, so the first question that I would have is, you know, because I mean, it is a pretty quick, I haven't seen the application or the notice of intent to apply is due tomorrow. And then the application deadline is March 29th, and not knowing, you know, that's a week. I mean, that's a pretty quick turnaround.
I think it's Monday, right? So we would be approving it next week.
You know, so I don't know the extent of the application, what's required. I'm not sure what planning has already been completed. You know, the one thing that I will say from my own personal experience on working on various grants is, you know, there's nothing worse than writing a project plan to fit into a grant versus, you know, having a plan in place and then being able to put that into a grant application. So I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm going to have to rely on Cynthia and figure out where this falls into, you know, does she have enough time, or what is she going to have to set aside with another project to submit this application?
Thank you for that. The other question that I would have, let's say we were successful, we submitted an application, what would that mean if we were awarded this grant? Are we in the position right now to be able to facilitate this grant?
My understanding is that Cynthia doesn't apply for grants that she's not ready to do, but Ken can answer that perhaps better than me.
Thank you.
And I think this is one of those that kind of questions, because on the, because I know she has been looking at, on some way to some type of a pilot and what it would look like. I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered that I think, or questions that are open, that it would probably be open questions included in the grant application because of, the buses, and if it's truly a pilot project, if we're doing that, then we want to, how are we evaluating the effectiveness of a pilot project? You know, what are the routes that this bus is running? Do we have facility limitations right now? Do we have a place for, you know, like if this is electric buses, where's the charging stations? And, you know, I think those are a lot of open questions that I think would be questions included in our grant application that, and I know Cynthia is more than capable of putting together a proposal and having the framework of what the pilot project could look like. But I have a meeting with Cynthia. We have our meetings on Thursday afternoons, depending on, you know, formal session. But you know, I can get more information, and, you know, if the board would be okay to, if there's not necessarily, you know, if there's not a motion to apply, but the board would be open to us further exploring that. And if Cynthia thinks she can do it, to go ahead and submit it, and we could bring back the application for ratification next week. If there's consensus to proceed in that manner, that would allow me some additional time to talk to Cynthia and see where this is and if she has the bandwidth to proceed.
To clarify, Chair, thank you, Ken. To clarify, that we always, or we have been in the practice of approving grant applications. So that's what we would get next week, no matter what you decided about an application or not. It's just about a letter of intent or not right now.
Thank you. You're correct. Yeah, because the timing of it, we would have to have a grant application ready for next Thursday for the board to approve for submittal on that following Monday.
Yeah, I would be inclined to sort of have Ken speak with Cynthia and ask her to be candid about not only where she is in terms of being able to get this application done, but also whether or not this is the best time to begin such a project and what all that means, because I'd hate for her to have to be sort of boxed into a corner where she felt like, oh, I guess I have to make this happen. I'm going to let all this other stuff over here go. And then now we have a thing. And what do we do with this thing? Because we're not ready for this thing. I just want to make sure that we're not just saying, okay, well, there's a grant and we've got to grab for the grant. I think that sometimes those things can really be problematic. So I would say without any particular motion or anything, but just consensus for Ken to have a conversation with Cynthia to bring concerns. And then if it's possible for her to do it and it makes sense in her mind, then we can go ahead and think in terms of that. Does that require a motion, a specific motion? Okay.
I think if there's consensus.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That sounds good. And I apologize. I didn't realize how short of a notice it was to get that letter of intent in.
A lot of these things happen that way. So thank you for bringing that to us. And thank you, Ken.
It has been simmering. Cynthia has been looking for the opportunity to apply for grants to purchase low emissions vehicles, as Ken said in the transit plan.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So let's go ahead and we'll close this formal session and open a public hearing. And that public hearing is docket C-22-20/SDR-26-20, which is an application for conditional use and site design review for a wine production facility, a winery, and by appointment tasting room. That's tax lot number 3321-913. The address is 10275 Northeast Warden Hill Road in Dundee. The applicant is Jared Etzel, the owner, and Etzel and Lubunsky LLC. The appellant is Elizabeth Seeberger. This was continued from March 11th, 2021, and will begin at the point of staff recommendation. Ken Friday, thank you for joining us. And Desiree Lundeen is here as well. Nice to see you both.
Yes, and I'll have Desiree go on with the staff recommendation, and then I'll throw in a few comments at the end.
Thank you, Director. Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. The appellant's concerns were spelled out in the request for appeal and more broadly in the March 10th submittal to the Board of Commissioners. The first issue raised is whether the winery and tasting room can be processed as a conditional use. Specifically, the appellant asserts that section 402.04 subsection G allows for commercial activities that are in conjunction with farm use, but precludes the processing of farm crops, which are listed as a permitted use. However, section 402.10 subsection I4 clearly states a facility for production and sale of wine that does not conform to the attributes described in subsections 402.10 subsection I1 through 3 above may be deemed a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use pursuant to subsection 402.04G. Therefore, the ordinance makes it clear that this application can be processed as a conditional use. The second issue raised is incompatibility with the Yamhill Comprehensive Plan as it relates to water. While the comprehensive plan outlines the goals and policies related to land uses, including water, it does not grant authority to the county to regulate water, as this responsibility has been exclusively vested in the State Department of Water Resources. Our office has sent a referral to the Water Resources Department and has communicated with, or has had communication from the Water Master, Joel Plon. Mr. Plon has not objected to the request. Nonetheless, it is appropriate for the applicant to show that they have a legal source of water. Our office will be recommending such a condition of any approval, and if approved, we'll send a copy of this decision to the Water Resources Department. The appellant makes several claims, attempting to show that the site plan provided is incomplete and erroneous. The site plan is actually quite good and provides a good understanding of the project. If you'd like me to explain in detail about the site plan, I am prepared to do so, but I do want to point out that section 1101.04 subsection B states the director may waive submittal requirements consistent with the scale of the project being reviewed. Upon determining that requirements requested to be waived are not necessary for an effective evaluation of the site development plan. The items listed as missing from the plan were not deemed necessary for an effective evaluation of the site plan. The next concern raised by the appellant is that the proposed 11 parking spots to serve the use are deficient and do not meet the requirements under section 1007.01 of the YCZO. Section 1007.02 subsection C states that the parking standard for eating or drinking establishments, including wine tasting rooms, shall be 1 space per 100 square feet of floor area, plus 1 space for each employee. To determine the off-street parking requirement, our office looks to the floor area of the building or structure primary to the functioning of the particular use. The floor area of the building area that will serve the use are those areas that are accessible to the public. Those areas of the building do not include storage, administrative offices, or spaces not open to the public. The proposed parking meets this criterion. While the appellant lists a number of disagreements with the staff report, it appears that the main argument comes down to the appellant's assertions that the underlying zoning and comprehensive plan designation for this property are incompatible with the proposed use. The appellant cites comprehensive plan policies related to urban and rural development. Those policies do not apply, as this application is not for an urban use, nor is it in a rural residential zone. This area is a farm zone, which allows this type of use. The next issue raised by the appellant deals with traffic counts provided by Yamhill County Public Works Road Department. Staff wishes to clarify that while the appellant addresses the information provided as a traffic study, it's important to note that the information provided was only traffic counts and crash data gathered from ODOT. These traffic counts have previously been provided to the board, so staff will not belabor the point. However, there is nothing in the record to indicate that Warden Hill Road cannot adequately serve the slight to modest increase in traffic from employees, deliveries, and customers generated by the proposed use. Staff finds that with conditions, the applicant has satisfied the conditional use requirements outlined in section 1202.02 as well as the site design review standards outlined in section 1101.02 of the YCZO. For these reasons, staff recommends approval of the applicant's proposed winery and by appointment tasting room with the 15 conditions of approval. I believe Mr. Friday would like to add a few comments.
Thank you. I just wanted to make mention of a few items. First, during the hearing, Ms. Seeberger made it sound like our office had done something wrong by not passing on her January 25th letter to the Planning Commission. The last date for her to comment was January 21st. So simply stated, her letter fell outside of the open record period and into the time period reserved for the applicant and the applicant only to submit testimony. I did explain that to her in an email and let her know that she could call me with questions, but she never did that. I just wanted to let you know there's nothing improper about the handling of her submittal, and I was a little dismayed that she suggested otherwise. Also, I noted that both the opponents and Friends of Yamhill County spoke about the replacement dwelling, and Friends suggested conditions be placed on it. I just wanted to be clear that the dwelling is not part of this request, and it would not be proper to put conditions on the dwelling. Lastly, while this area is zoned for farm use, I do understand and I sympathize that there's a feeling amongst the residents of this area that this is a residential subdivision and not a farm zone. And if the 13 property owners want to get together to apply to rezone their land, I'm happy to meet with them and to explain that this is a very difficult application to do. However, state statute requires the county to evaluate the application under the land use criteria as of the day the application was submitted. It's a standard known as the goalpost rule, essentially that once an application has been made, you cannot move the goalposts by change in the standard. In this case, the applicant is looking for approval of a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use in an existing farm zone. And it's really a pretty modest request of a small winery with a by appointment only tasting room. The goals and policies of the comprehensive plan that deal with rural residential and urban uses just don't apply to this request. So as stated by Desiree Lundeen, we're recommending approval with the conditions applied by the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Mr. Friday. So at this time, we'll close the public hearing and open this up for deliberation. Commissioners, thoughts?
Well, first, Chair, if I may, thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Ken Friday, for your work on this. You've answered a lot of, I mean, I kind of know the answer, but you've answered for the public and for our peace of mind, I think, a lot of the questions that were raised about this particular application. And I want to say that I listened closely to what Catherine Jernstead had to say about limiting production from this site so that it's scaled to the site. And I thought about that a lot. And I did that kind of rough math of what we've approved for other conditional use or commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, wineries on smaller landscapes. And I come back to, I still feel comfortable with that 5,000 case limit. I would be willing, if other commissioners are concerned, I think I could go down further, but it's clear to me that the Etzels are very skilled at growing and producing wine. And I don't think that the scale of this operation is out of proportion to the area. If this was a really big winery, I would have a lot of concerns about it on the scale of that location. And I do think that, so my last thought on this is that there were a lot of comments in testimony and in our written documents about paving the roads and the increase in traffic. And I think that for us commissioners, we should probably keep that in mind going forward, is that people on roads love to have their roads paved if they've been gravel until the increase in traffic and the increase in speed comes up. And Commissioner Starrett, you've heard it way more than me, so you know this as well, right? So I think that going forward, let's just please keep that in mind too. I know that our Public Works Department is keenly aware of the benefits and the drawbacks to having that happen. So I just want to put those thoughts out there. I feel comfortable with this application and the scale of the operation.
Do we have a motion?
I just wanted to make sure other people had an opportunity.
Chair, I agree with what Commissioner Kula said. I would say just in general that, farmers are very hyper sensitive and aware of the impacts of all of their use of their land, water, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I noted the makeup of the Planning Commission does have several farmers who also live in rural areas and have faced these issues themselves. So I will make a motion, and my motion is my motion to approve.
To approve the planning.
I would make a motion to approve if you didn't, so.
Okay. Motion to
make
approve.
a motion to approve the conditional use permit, I guess it is, and site design review for the wine production facility on tax lot 3321-913 at 10275 Northeast Warden Hill Road, Dundee.
All right, we have a motion to approve the application. Any further discussion?
Could I
I just said one thing, and it looks like Ken Friday has one thing too.
Okay.
I'm going to say, is the motion to approve with the conditions recommended by the Planning Commission?
Yes. Do you want to amend your motion, Commissioner Berschauer?
Yes, I will amend my motion to include the recommendations that the Planning Commission has set forth.
Okay, great. And Commissioner Kula?
Yes, thank you. I regularly have discussions with groups of winemakers and grape growers who are very supportive of the CACFU, or the commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, and the permitted winery. And Ken Friday is nodding because he regularly does too. And they're very grateful for what is allowed in code and in statute, but often express concern about the scale of having, the potential of having every tax lot on a road in both directions, both sides. And I know that this is probably something that the Planning Commission can address, but maybe it's a legislative decision at the legislature, but it does seem like at some point we do need to think about how many per mile of road or how many wineries, because at some point our little bit here and little bit there builds up. And I know that when there's helicopters going and limos going and buses, that it can be really hard on farmers and on neighbors who aren't the wineries and the producers. So I just want to put that out there that at some point I think we are a big wine producing region, even though we're a small county. And I think it would behoove us to discuss that at some point, not here.
Thank you for that. The one thing I want to make sure we don't do is adopt that drawbridge mentality. I've got mine, and now I'm going to make sure that I limit anyone else from having the opportunity to do that. When people have I believe that they're guaranteed, again, a constitutional right to their property, to the use of their property, and these are clearly in conjunction with Yamhill County and state regulations and zoning and laws. So I applaud the initiative. I always feel sad for people who have had to defend their right to operate on their own property. And I understand the right of appeal, but I appreciate that people will go through, but I always also feel very uncomfortable when people feel like they have to come to us with their hat in their hand and ask for permission to use their property. So it's always wonderful when we're able to just say, yeah, this is a unanimous decision. So we have a motion and we've had discussion. All those in favor of approving the application with the conditions recommended by the Planning Commission signify by saying aye. Aye. The motion passes. And thank you, Desiree. A lot of work went into this. It's a really thick packet. And Ken, thank you very much for your work on this.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, we will have the findings back to you on April 1st, no fooling, for adoption.
Okay, thank you, Todd.
And we'll get those to you in advance so you can have a look at them.
Okay, great. Thank you for your work on that as well. Thank you. Thank you all. All right, so we'll go back into formal session, which is announcements. Does anybody have announcements that they want to share?
I would just share that I've already shared this, but that the Parkway Committee expressed a great deal of interest, the mayors and city councilors there as well, and former mayors, in having low emission vehicles as part of transit. And so they made that unanimous recommendation, but it's also, there is, I think they're calling them congressionally directed spending, also known as earmarks. So there's an earmark available for this as well. So they wanted us to apply for them. I'm going to have further discussions with them to see what that looks like.
Thank you
Just
very much. Appreciate that, Commissioner. Commissioner Berschauer, updates, announcements?
Thank you, Chair. I believe there is a filing deadline tomorrow for school boards and different kinds of boards. I'm trying to think of all the positions, but there is a looming deadline tomorrow. So if you are interested in running for the school board or whatever it might be, make sure you get your stuff filed.
And we need folks from the West Valley, Sheridan and Willamina. Those.
I want to say it's actually today at 5.
The 18th. The
Yes,
18th.
You're right. I was thinking in my mind the 18th tomorrow, Thursday, but we're now in Thursday.
So 5 o'clock.
Today's the deadline.
West Valley folks, get your application, get your information into the clerk's office. I just want to say that in a couple of hours, in about an hour and a half, I'm going to be testifying in favor of House Bill 3239, which would restrict cannabis processing facilities to strictly industrial zones. The folks on Chehalem Mountain have been very concerned about the facility in their area. And so this is a bill that Representative Post is sponsoring, and I'm hoping that we can get some support to move it out of committee. So that's all I have. If there's anything else for the good of the order, anything else? Hearing nothing, we'll go ahead and adjourn today's meeting. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.